It began with a whisper, a border skirmish few outside Korea even noticed. But within days, it exploded into a brutal firestorm that would pull in the world's superpowers, ignite the Cold War, and leave millions dead. Cities turned to ashes, families torn in half. And when the guns finally fell silent, nothing was truly over. This is not just the story of a war forgotten. This is the war that never ended. A war of trenches and jets, of politics and propaganda, of unsung heroes and silent scars, from the frozen hell of Chosin to the tense silence of Panmunjom. This is the Korean War, told like never before. You know World War II. You've heard of Vietnam. But what happened in Korea changed everything and shaped the world you live in today. This is the war the world tried to forget. But history never forgets. Chapter 1. A Divided Peninsula, Korea, a land of ancient mountains, rice fields, dynasties, and centuries of independence, stood quietly on the edge of the Pacific for most of its history. But the tides of war, empires, and ideology would soon rip it in two. What was once a single nation, proud, united, and whole, became the stage for one of the most bitter divisions of the 20th century. The story begins not in Korea itself, but in the ashes of World War II. For 35 long years, from 1910 to 1945, Korea endured brutal colonization under Imperial Japan. Korean culture was suppressed. Its language was banned from schools. Its people were forced into labor, into war, into silence. Resistance was crushed with steel and fire. And yet, it never fully died. From mountain guerrillas to secret schools, a quiet, stubborn spirit endured. Then came 1945. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Japan, brought to its knees, surrendered. And with that, the empire collapsed. Korea was, at last, free. But freedom would come. With a heavy price to as Japan surrendered, the question echoed across the Allied powers. Who would take control of Korea now? In Washington, with only hours to decide before Soviet forces swept down the peninsula, two young American colonels, Dean Rusk and Charles Bonesteel, were handed an impossible task. Draw a line across the Korean Peninsula. Fast, armed with a National Geographic map, they chose the 38th parallel. Not for strategy, not for politics, but simply because it split the country roughly in half and kept Seoul, the capital, in the American zone. The Soviets, surprisingly, agreed. And so, without Korean input, without a vote, without a voice, the nation was split by pencil on a map. In the north, Soviet troops moved in. In the south, the Americans arrived. The people of Korea, battered, grieving, but hopeful. This was meant to be temporary. A brief occupation, a transition, a time to rebuild. But that hope would soon unravel. The North, under Soviet guidance, began building a socialist regime. Kim Il-sung, a young guerrilla fighter who had spent years in exile, rose quickly to the top. Backed by Moscow, he became the face of the new Democratic People's Republic of Korea, a state forged in Stalin's shadow, centralized, controlled. Militant. In the South, the Americans installed Syngman Rhee, an older, American-educated nationalist who had spent decades abroad. He was fiercely anti-communist, deeply authoritarian, and saw himself as the rightful ruler of all Korea. The Republic of Korea was born, a state that claimed sovereignty over the entire peninsula. Two leaders, two ideologies, one nation, and both sides claiming the other was illegitimate. In the north, land was seized from the wealthy and redistributed to peasants. Industry was nationalized. The cult of Kim Il-sung began to grow. In the south, political instability roiled. Leftist uprisings, right-wing crackdowns, violent purges, all under the nervous watch of American troops. The U.S. wanted stability. What they got was unrest. By 1948, both North and South had declared themselves the sole government of Korea. The division, once temporary, had become real. Hard borders, separate currencies, two armies, growing fast, and the people, families, were split. Letters stopped coming. Brothers on one side could not visit sisters on the other. Weddings were postponed. Elders died waiting. Children were born into silence, never knowing the voices of half their family. The Cold War was tightening its grip on the world, and Korea was now caught in the middle. Stalin in the Soviet Union, Truman in the White House, Mao in China. The world was dividing, and Korea was the fault line. Yet despite the growing tension, there was still hope that unification might come. Somehow, peacefully. But beneath that hope, the drums of war were already beating. Across the border, both sides built their forces. North Korea, with Soviet tanks and Chinese support, trained hard, recruited fast. South Korea, with limited American weapons, lagged behind, but still prepared. Each side believed it was only a matter of time. And for Kim Il-sung, time was running out that he watched the world with sharp eyes. In 1949, Mao had taken China. A communist wave was sweeping Asia. The Americans were pulling back, distracted by Europe and a new war scare in Berlin. Kim saw his chance that he needed Stalin's approval, and he got it. He went to Moscow. He promised a swift, decisive war. A war that would be over in days. The South would collapse, he said. The people would rise up. Victory would be quick. Stalin, cautious but intrigued, agreed. On one condition: no Soviet troops. If the Americans intervened, Kim was on his own. Then came Mao. He too agreed, quietly, watching from the sidelines. And so, in the shadows of great powers, a secret decision was made. The Korean Peninsula, already torn, would become a battlefield. But none of this was yet known to the farmers in the South, planting rice under a warm June sun, nor to the schoolchildren in Pyongyang, reciting slogans under red banners. On the surface, the 38th parallel stood quiet, just another line on a map. But behind it, weapons moved. Soldiers gathered. Orders were given. In the early hours of June 25, 1950, war would explode across Korea. But before that moment, before the tanks rolled south, before the bombs fell, before a nation bled, there was only the line. A single line, drawn by strangers and guarded by men who did not know that the future of Asia, and perhaps the world, was about to change forever. This was the beginning of the Korean War. Chapter 2. Red Dawn over Seoul. It was still dark when the first artillery shell screamed through the early morning silence. June 25, 1950, a Sunday, across the 38th parallel, without warning, tens of thousands of North Korean troops surged forward. Columns of Soviet-made T-34 tanks rolled across the border. Artillery units opened fire. Waves of infantry poured through gaps in the hills and rice paddies. It was sudden, brutal, and completely unexpected. The Korean War had begun. For weeks, the skies over the peninsula had been calm. Border skirmishes had occurred before, small exchanges, nothing more. But this was different. This was war, coordinated, deliberate, and overwhelming. By dawn, more than 75,000 soldiers of the Korean People's Army, the KPA, were sweeping into South Korea, backed by tanks, heavy weapons, and iron determination. The soldiers stationed along the border, it was chaos. Outgunned and underprepared. The Republic of Korea's army, the ROK, scrambled to respond. They lacked tanks. They lacked modern artillery. Many had never seen combat. They held rifles. Some held nothing at all. Reports flew into Seoul. The North had crossed. The North was advancing. Commanders rushed to their posts. Phones rang. Radios crackled. But the speed of the assault left little time to react. In the first few hours, entire ROK positions collapsed. Trenches were abandoned. Roads clogged with retreating troops and terrified civilians. Towns near the border, Kaesong, Chuncheon, Wjeongbu, fell quickly. The 38th parallel was no longer a line. It was now a memory. President Syngman Rhee, awakened by AIDS, refused at first to believe the scale of the attack. He had expected minor provocations, a show of force. Perhaps. Not this. Not the full weight of the North Korean military crashing down across the border. In Washington, it was still Saturday night. President Truman was in Missouri. The U.S. State Department received word from its embassy in Seoul. A full-scale invasion was underway. Within hours, the United Nations was alerted, but for the people of Seoul, there was no time for politics. Sirens screamed. Panic spread. The capital, just 35 miles from the border, was suddenly under threat. Markets emptied. Streets flooded with families carrying what they could, bags, children, memories, all fleeing south. Smoke rose in the distance. And still, the northern advance did not stop. North Korean forces moved with precision. Soviet advisors had helped plan every detail. Their strategy was clear: strike hard, move fast, take Seoul before the South, or the world, could respond. They pushed down two main routes, through Ujeongbu in the west and across the central mountains in the east. The ROK units tried to hold the line at key points, but resistance crumbled under the weight of tanks and artillery. By the evening of the first day, northern troops were within striking distance of the capital. In Seoul, fear turned to desperation. Banks closed, bridges jammed with carts, bicycles, and trucks. Refugees surged southward in a flood of confusion. Police tried to restore order, but there was little they could do. The Han River, which cuts through the heart of Seoul, became a line of defense and a line of escape. South Korean officials feared the enemy would cross it by morning. With little warning to the public, the government gave the order: destroy the bridges. And so, in the dead of night, as thousands of civilians crowded on the Hangang Bridge, engineers lit the charges. The explosion tore through steel and concrete. Hundreds of people, many families, plunged into the river below. Some survived. Many did not. It was one of the war's first tragedies. And it would not be the last. By June 27th, just 2 days after the invasion, Seoul was under direct attack. Shells landed in the outskirts. Gunfire echoed in the streets. ROK forces, overwhelmed, began retreating through the southern neighborhoods. Some fought bravely. Others deserted. The front lines collapsed into confusion. Syngman Rhee and his inner circle fled the capital by train, heading south to Daejeon. Government ministries were abandoned. Foreign diplomats scrambled to evacuate. The city that had once symbolized hope for a new Korea now stood defenseless. On June 28, 1950, just 3 days after the war began, North Korean troops marched into Seoul. The capital fell. Red banners were raised. Loudspeakers blared propaganda. Residents were ordered to remain indoors. Those suspected of collaborating with the government were arrested. Executions followed. The swiftness of the fall stunned the world. Newspapers from Tokyo to New York ran the headline: Seoul falls. For the United States and the United Nations, it was a turning point. Truman convened an emergency meeting. He saw Korea not just as a far-off war, but as the first real test of the Cold War. That if the West allowed a Soviet-backed invasion to succeed in Korea, what would stop the next? In Taiwan, in Greece, in Berlin. Communism, he believed, must be stopped. On June 27th, the U.S. ordered its Navy and Air Force to support South Korea. The 7th Fleet was sent to the Taiwan Strait. American F-80 jets flew missions to protect evacuations and bomb advancing northern forces. The United Nations, the Soviet Union, by a twist of fate, was boycotting the Security Council in protest over the exclusion of Communist China. As a result, the Council passed Resolution 83, calling members to assist South Korea in repelling the attack. It was the first time in history that the UN would take military action to stop aggression. For now, the ROK army fell back, regrouping along the Nakdong River in the southeast. American troops had not yet landed, and Seoul was gone. But for those who remained behind, in silence, under occupation, the war had just begun. Men were pulled from their homes. Political opponents were shot in the streets. Propaganda was pumped through every radio, every school, every hall. Families whispered in fear. Dissent was not tolerated. Yet in basements, in alleyways, in secret, some began to resist: young students, retired officers, farmers, mothers. They buried radios, passed messages, hid fugitives. The occupation would not be permanent, they told themselves. Help would come. Seoul would rise again. But in the north, Kim Il-sung was emboldened. The capital had fallen just as he'd predicted. The South Korean army appeared broken. The Americans were slow to react. Victory, he believed, was within reach. His forces kept moving south, past Suwon, past Osan, toward Taiwan, and beyond that. Busan. His plan was simple. Take the entire peninsula before the Americans could stop him. But even as Seoul burned, something else had been set in motion. Thousands of miles away, ships were loading men, fuel, and machines of war. American divisions were being reactivated. Bombers took flight. Generals drew battle lines. The fall of Seoul had shocked the world into action. And in that chaos, in the smoke-filled skies above the Han River, in the broken streets where children cried for their mothers, in the homes now flying red flags, a new chapter of the Cold War had opened. The Korean Peninsula, once quiet, once divided only by an invisible line, was now fully at war. And in the heart of it all, Seoul, bleeding, battered, and occupied, waited to be reclaimed. But that day was still far away. Chapter 3. The World Reacts. UN's Gamble. The news moved faster than the tanks. By the time Seoul fell, headlines had already crossed oceans. Korea invaded, they read. Communists advanced south. The world was no longer watching from a distance. It was awake, alert, and unsure of what would come next. In Washington, President Harry Truman paced a quiet room in Independence, Missouri. It was late. The phone call from the White House had come quickly, with urgency in every word. Korea had been invaded. American allies were stunned. American generals were alarmed. But Truman was furious. To him, this wasn't just another distant war. This was a test, not just of Korea's future, but of the post-war world order. Just 5 years earlier, the world had crawled out of the rubble of World War II with a solemn promise. No more wars of conquest. No more invasions unchecked. And now here it was, a nation, backed by communists, swallowing its neighbor by force. Truman saw it as a breach, a challenge, a spark that, if left to burn, could ignite a much greater fire. And he wasn't alone. In London, Paris, Ottawa, Canberra, diplomats scrambled. Military attaches rewound film reels, studied troop movements, counted divisions. But no one had answers yet. Only questions. Why now? How far would Kim Il-sung go? Would Stalin send troops? Would the Americans intervene? Would China follow? At the United Nations headquarters in New York, delegates rushed into emergency session. Inside a tall, glass-paneled building in Manhattan, the Security Council assembled under pressure. The room buzzed with tension. Papers shuffled. Voices whispered. The Soviet chair was empty, and that would change everything. For months, the Soviet Union had been boycotting the Security Council. Their protest? The Council's refusal to recognize Communist China, the People's Republic, as the legitimate government of China, instead favoring Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government, then exiled in Taiwan. Because of that absence, that empty chair, the Soviets forfeited their veto. It was an extraordinary moment, a geopolitical accident, and the United States would seize it. On June 25th, just hours after the invasion began, the Security Council passed Resolution 82, condemning North Korea's aggression and demanding an immediate withdrawal. The vote passed easily. The world had seen many small border clashes before, but this was different. This was a coordinated, full-scale assault. Still, words were not enough. 2 days later, on June 27th, the council met again. The fighting had intensified. Seoul was falling. Refugees were flooding the countryside. South Korea's army was collapsing. And so, the United States pushed for a second resolution, Resolution 83, calling upon member states to furnish military assistance to repel the attack. This wasn't just diplomatic language. This was a call to war. It passed. Again, no Soviet veto. And with that, the United Nations authorized what would become its first ever collective military action. The gamble had begun. Washington moved quickly. President Truman addressed the nation with calm urgency. He declared that the U.S. would send air and naval support to South Korea, not just in defense of Korea, but in defense of peace, of international law, of the very idea that aggression could not be allowed to triumph in a post-war world. His advisors warned of escalation. Some feared that intervening in Korea might provoke the Soviet Union. Others feared China would enter. But Truman held firm. If we let Korea go by default, he said, the Soviet leaders will be emboldened to override nations closer to our own shores. The logic was simple, but dangerous. If Korea fell without resistance, what would stop the next domino from toppling? 2. The American public, it was framed as a necessary act. The beginning of a police action, not a war. Truman never asked Congress for a formal declaration. He sidestepped the word war altogether, an echo of the hard lessons from World War II. But to the soldiers boarding ships and planes, the meaning was clear. Korea would not be a mission of peacekeeping. It would be a battlefield. Orders were sent to the Pacific. General Douglas MacArthur, already stationed in Japan as Supreme Commander of Allied powers, was placed in charge of operations. He had been waiting for this moment that MacArthur, a towering figure in military history, had not fought a war since. 1945, he saw Korea not just as a mission, but as a moral crusade, a chance to strike back against communist expansion and secure America's place in Asia. From his headquarters in Tokyo, he began to move swiftly. Supplies were gathered, transport planes loaded, intelligence units dispatched. But time was against him. Why now? South Korean forces were in full retreat, pushed back along highways and river valleys, struggling to slow the northern advance. The capital had fallen. The enemy was moving south, fast. American air support arrived first. Fighters and bombers flew out of Japan, attacking North Korean supply lines and tanks. Navy vessels steamed into the Yellow Sea and the Sea of Japan, providing cover and reconnaissance. But airstrikes alone could not stop an army that MacArthur needed boots on the ground. On June 30th, Truman authorized the use of American ground troops. The 24th Infantry Division, based in Japan, was the first to go. They were young, inexperienced, ill-prepared for what lay ahead. Their first engagement would take place near the town of Chosin, a small detachment known as Task Force Smith. Around 500 American troops, with light arms and a few howitzers, were ordered to slow down the advancing North Koreans. It was a desperate attempt that on July 5th, they met the enemy. Rows of T-34 tanks, followed by hundreds of infantry, descended on their position. The Americans fired, but their weapons were too weak to stop the tanks. Ammunition ran low. Radios failed. One by one, positions fell. After hours of brutal fighting, the survivors withdrew. 80 men were dead. Dozens captured. It was America's first battle in the Korean War. And it was a defeat, but it bought time. More troops began to arrive from Japan. The UN command was formalized. 16 nations pledged support. Some would send soldiers, like Britain, Turkey, Australia, and Canada. Others would send medical teams, equipment, or funds. It was the first time the world had truly come together, under the banner of the United Nations, to resist aggression with force. Still, this was no united front. Behind the scenes, tensions brewed. Some countries questioned America's leadership. Others worried the war would spiral beyond Korea. Even among U.S. generals, strategies clashed. And back in Moscow, Joseph Stalin watched carefully. The Soviet leader had not expected such a swift global response. But he would not step in. Not directly. He had given Kim Il-sung the green light, but warned that if the Americans intervened, it would be Kim's war to fight. Stalin did not want another world war. Not yet, but he quietly increased support. More weapons, more advisors, and above all, a whisper to Mao in China to keep his troops ready. Meanwhile, in the halls of the UN, the resolutions had passed, but the question remained. Would it work? Could a multinational force, hastily assembled, stop a well-prepared, Soviet-backed army? Could diplomacy translate into victory on the battlefield? Or had the world just signed itself into a long and brutal conflict? By July, the lines were hardening. American troops were arriving by the thousands. The South Korean army was regrouping. Civilians, caught in the crossfire, fled further south, to Daegu, to Busan, to the coast. Fields burned. Towns emptied. Roads became rivers of fear and desperation. And the enemy kept coming. To the soldiers fighting, to the mothers searching for their children, to the generals watching maps in darkened rooms. It no longer mattered what the resolutions had said. The war was real. The IT had begun with a surprise invasion. It had sparked a global response. And now, in the valleys and hills of a small peninsula half a world away, it would be fought, not just by Koreans, but by men from dozens of nations, bound not by history or culture, but by a shared gamble, a gamble made in the name of peace. A gamble made by a world still haunted by the last Great War, and a gamble that would, before long, cost more lives than anyone had yet dared to imagine. Chapter 4. Retreat to Busan. By mid-July of 1950, the Korean Peninsula was burning. North Korean forces had swept through the heart of the South like a blade through silk, relentless, organized, and well-armed. City after city had fallen. Seoul was gone, Daejeon lost, and the Southern Army, battered and retreating, was running out of places to run. American reinforcements had begun to arrive, but they were late, and they were green. The first U.S. troops to land in Korea, the 24th Infantry Division, were understrength, poorly equipped, and unprepared for the enemy they faced. Many of their weapons were relics of the last war. Their training had grown stale. Some of the men had never fired a shot in combat. They learned quickly. The first engagements, Chosin, Chachawan, Daejeon, were bloody and chaotic. American units fought with bravery, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. At Daejeon, Major General William Dean was captured while covering his troops' retreat, becoming the highest-ranking U.S. officer taken prisoner during the war. The loss was symbolic. The message was clear. The North was winning, and now only a sliver of land remained, the far southeast corner of Korea, anchored by the port city of Busan. This was it, the last defensible position. A crooked line drawn across the Korean map, encircling a shrinking patch of territory roughly 100 miles long and 50 miles deep. Mountains on one side, sea on the other. This would be where the South made its final stand. It would become known as the Busan Perimeter. Inside that pocket were nearly 2 million people, soldiers, civilians, children, refugees. Roads were choked with wagons and trucks, families clutching whatever belongings they could carry. Bodies lined the paths, some from exhaustion, others from stray gunfire. Disease spread. Food grew scarce. And yet, they kept coming. South. Koreans fleeing the advancing northern tide. Hoping, praying, that Busan would hold. The port itself had become a lifeline. American ships offloaded supplies day and night. Crates of ammunition, rations, tanks, fuel, blood plasma. Medical tents spread like white scars across the hillsides. Wounded men were lined up on stretchers, silent and staring, while doctors worked under buzzing floodlights, their hands red and shaking. General Walton Walker, commander of the 8th U.S. Army, took control of the ground defense. His orders were blunt: hold the line at all costs. There could be no retreat. There was nowhere left to go. He told his men, "We're going to hold this line. There will be no more retreating. There is no rear." Morale was brittle. Units were exhausted. The heat was crushing, thick with humidity, insects, and the stench of death. Yet still, day after day, the North pushed forward. And day after day, the South and its allies dug in deeper. The terrain helped. The perimeter was backed by mountains and flanked by rivers. It funneled enemy movements into narrow corridors, kill zones where artillery and mortars could be concentrated. Engineers worked around the clock to fortify positions. Barbed wire, sandbags, tank traps. Every inch of dirt became a battleground. And yet, the North kept coming. In August, they launched a full-scale assault. 6 divisions struck at different points, near Masan, the Naktong Bulge, and the Taegu sector. These were not probing attacks. These were designed to break the perimeter completely. They nearly did. At the Naktong River, North Korean troops swam across under cover of darkness, building makeshift rafts, dragging their weapons behind them. In some areas, they succeeded in establishing bridgeheads. American and South Korean forces were driven back, briefly. Hand-to-hand combat raged in the hills. Flamethrowers roared. Grenades flashed through the night. But reinforcements came quickly. U.S. commanders had learned from the first defeats. Reserves were held in position. Artillery was used with deadly accuracy. Aircraft buzzed overhead, dropping napalm and strafing enemy convoys. The tide, for once, did not rise. It broke. Still, the cost was immense. Entire villages were leveled. Hills were taken, lost, and taken again. The names of these battles, Bloody Ridge, Hill 303, the Naktong Bulge, would be etched in memory, not for their strategic value, but for the price paid in blood. The South Korean army, shattered just weeks earlier, began to harden. New recruits joined daily. Many had no uniforms, no rifles, only armbands and farming tools. But they fought, not because they had orders, but because this was their land, their home. Their families were behind them, and there was nowhere else to fall back to. American forces, too, found resolve. Units that had stumbled now stood firm. The 1st Cavalry, the 2nd Infantry Division, the 25th, they held the perimeter with grit and firepower. Tanks rolled down dirt roads. Mortars thumped rhythmically in the hills. Pilots flew dozens of missions a day, their eyes scanning for convoys and bridges. Air superiority became a decisive edge, and always, behind the lines, the port of Busan kept working like a beating heart. Supplies flowed in. Reinforcements landed. The perimeter held, but just barely. At the same time, whispers reached enemy lines. Whispers of something building far to the west. Of American troops gathering. Of a general preparing a counterstrike. Of ships being loaded not for defense, but for an invasion. Kim Il-sung, sensing victory slipping from his grasp, ordered one final push. He believed the Americans were tired, that the South Koreans were broken, that one more assault would break the line. It nearly worked. In early September, North Korean forces again crossed the Naktong in strength. They advanced toward Taegu, a key city near the center of the perimeter. The fighting was savage. Entire units were surrounded. Communication broke down. American artillery units found themselves firing at enemies just yards away. One hill changed hands 7 times in a single day, but the defenders did not collapse. They adapted. They counterattacked. They used every ounce of firepower they had. And slowly, inch by inch, the northern momentum slowed, then stopped. For the first time since the war began, the offensive had failed. The perimeter, bruised, battered, soaked in blood, had held. And now, everything would change. Behind the scenes, General MacArthur had been planning something audacious, a landing far behind enemy lines. A move that, if successful, could encircle the North Korean army and cut off its supply lines. But that was still to come. For now, at Busan, the Allies had proven they could stop the tide. It wasn't just a military victory. It was psychological. It was proof, to the world, to their enemies, and to themselves, that the North could be resisted, that the line could hold. That hope, however thin, was not yet lost. The Busan perimeter was more than a battlefield. It was a symbol of resilience, of sacrifice, of the edge between survival and annihilation. And as the smoke cleared over the hills, as the dead were counted and the wounded lifted into ambulances, a new determination took root in every soldier who stood that line. The retreat had ended. The fight was far from over, but now the war would turn. Chapter 5. The man from Incheon. He stood alone, often silhouetted against windows, his cap tilted, corncob pipe clenched between his teeth, a figure larger than life, shrouded in legend and controversy. To his admirers, he was the savior of the Pacific, a man forged in battle and bathed in history. To his critics, he was a showman, stubborn and reckless. But on the edge of disaster, with the Korean Peninsula hanging by a thread, there was one truth no one could deny. General Douglas MacArthur was about to do something bold, something no one else dared attempt. As August turned into September 1950, the war in Korea was balanced on a knife's edge. The Busan perimeter had held, just barely. North Korean forces continued to press from the north and west, relentless and confident. Seoul had long since fallen. Half of South Korea was under enemy control. American and South Korean troops, holding out in the southeastern corner, were exhausted, outnumbered, hanging on, but only just. MacArthur believed victory would never come by holding the line. It had to come through shock, surprise, speed, and somewhere no one expected. He had seen the opportunity from the beginning, a narrow strip of coastline, far behind enemy lines, just west of Seoul. The port of Incheon, strategically. Incheon was a golden key. Capture it, and Seoul would be within reach. Enemy supply lines, stretched thin across the peninsula, could be severed. North Korean troops, deep in the south, would find themselves trapped. It could turn the tide of the entire war, but there was a reason no one supported the idea. Incheon was a nightmare for amphibious landings. The tides were among the highest in the world, rising and falling over 30 feet each day. Its harbor was narrow, twisted, and filled with mudflats. Seawalls loomed tall and hard. The approach channel was shallow and treacherous. There were only a few hours each day when landing craft could even approach the shore. And the North Koreans had assumed, correctly, that no sane commander would ever choose Incheon. Except one that MacArthur insisted he faced fierce opposition from nearly every advisor around him. The Navy warned of disaster. The Marines cautioned against overreach. Planners urged him to reconsider. But MacArthur was immovable. I realized that Incheon is a 5,000 to 1 gamble, he said. But I am used to taking such odds. In early September, with Washington's hesitant approval, the plan was set in motion. Code name: Operation Chromite.it would be one of the most daring amphibious operations since D-Day. The scale was immense. Over 260 ships, nearly 75,000 troops, aircraft carriers, destroyers, transports, minesweepers, supply vessels. The U.S. 1st Marine Division would lead the assault, supported by the U.S. Army's 7th Infantry Division and South Korean units. On paper, it was madness. In reality, it was MacArthur's moment. As the sun rose on September 15, 1950, the tide shifted, both literally and figuratively. Just before dawn, naval guns opened fire. A thunderous barrage of shells pounded Incheon's coastal defenses. Smoke poured into the sky. Buildings crumbled. The sea shook. Landing craft bobbed in the waves like corks as they surged toward the shore. The first wave hit the sea wall at Incheon's Wulmi-do Island. Marines scaled ladders under fire, throwing grenades, kicking down doors. The North Koreans, caught completely off guard, scrambled to respond. But it was too late. The defenders had expected an assault further south, near the Busan line. They believed their rear was secure. Now, they were staring down a tidal wave of American firepower landing right in their backyard. Within hours, Wulmi-do was taken. More troops followed. Tanks rolled onto the beach. Supplies flooded ashore. Incheon itself, stunned and smoking, began to fall. MacArthur, watching from aboard the USS Mount McKinley, came ashore later that day. His khaki uniform untouched, his stride steady and theatrical. He made sure the cameras saw him. Every step was deliberate. Every image carefully composed to the world. It was symbolic, the old general returning to war, taking command from the front. To the troops on the ground, it was the signal they had waited for. The operation was working. Incheon was in Allied hands. But MacArthur wasn't finished. He pushed immediately to retake Seoul. Some advised caution, worried that the city was too heavily defended, that pushing inland too quickly would stretch the lines. But MacArthur wanted the capital liberated by September 25, exactly 3 months after the war began. The battle for Seoul was brutal. North Korean forces had dug in. They turned buildings into bunkers, alleys into kill zones. Street by street, house by house, the fighting raged. Flames lit up the night. Civilians fled as bullets tore through the walls of homes and markets. American and South Korean troops fought side by side. Grenades exploded in courtyards. Tanks rumbled down shattered roads. The air was thick with dust, smoke, and blood. After nearly a week of combat, Seoul was recaptured. The South Korean flag once again flew over the capital. President Syngman returned to a city broken and bruised, but free. The psychological impact was enormous. Incheon was more than a military success. It was a message to North Korea, to the world, to the weary soldiers along the Busan line, that the tide had turned. The enemy had been outflanked. Their supply lines were cut. Their troops, still fighting in the south, began to falter. Communications broke down. Morale plummeted. Now, it was the north that was in retreat. That MacArthur ordered a general offensive. Allied forces, breaking out from both Incheon and the Busan Perimeter, began to converge. The two fronts, once separated by hundreds of miles, closed in like pincers to be by the end of September. The North Koreans were fleeing in disarray. Tens of thousands were captured. Others threw down their weapons and melted into the mountains. Seoul was secure. South Korea, at least for the moment, had been reclaimed. Operation Chromite had achieved the impossible. It had taken a collapsing war and flipped it in less than 2 weeks. It had restored confidence, disrupted the enemy, and given the Allies their first real victory. But in the euphoria that followed, in the cheers, in the parades, in the handshakes and medals, a deeper question began to form. Should they stop here, or should they press on? MacArthur had no doubt. He believed the North Korean army was finished, that pushing beyond the 38th parallel into the north would reunify Korea once and for all. His confidence soared. His words, once cautious, now brimmed with certainty. Home by Christmas, he told reporters. The phrase echoed across the headlines. Washington, however, was divided. Some feared that advancing into the north might provoke China or even draw the Soviets directly into the conflict. Intelligence reports warned of Chinese forces massing near the Yalu River. Warnings were issued. Concerns were raised, but MacArthur dismissed them. He believed the Chinese would not intervene, that they would not risk war with the United States, that the momentum was too strong to stop now. And so, as autumn deepened over the battered hills of Korea, American and South Korean troops crossed the 38th parallel. The war, once a desperate defense, had now become a bold march into enemy territory. The man from Incheon had changed the game. But what lay ahead, beyond the parallel, beyond the Yalu, was no longer familiar ground. It was something else entirely, and history was waiting. Chapter 6. Liberation and Beyond. The autumn winds swept through the war-torn streets of Seoul, carrying with them the scent of fire, the weight of memory, and the first fragile breath of freedom. The capital had been reclaimed, not without blood, not without ruin, but reclaimed nonetheless. Flags were raised. Soldiers embraced weeping civilians. The city, scarred by months of occupation and brutal street fighting, stood as a battered symbol of resistance. Yet as bells rang and church doors reopened, the war was not over. It was changing. The Incheon Landing had done the unthinkable. Within weeks, the tide had turned. North Korean forces, once charging toward the sea, now fled in chaos. Cut off, surrounded, disoriented. Roads once filled with refugees now saw columns of prisoners, heads bowed, hands tied. UN forces, led by the United States, reinforced by Britain, Australia, South Korea, and others, pressed forward relentlessly. MacArthur saw an opening, a rare and fleeting chance to not only drive the invaders back, but to finish the war itself. With Seoul liberated and the enemy on the run, the 38th parallel, once a dividing line, became a stepping stone. The question no longer was if the Allies would cross it. The question was how far they would go. On October 1st, 1950, South Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel. They were followed days later by U.S. and UN troops. The push northward began. The plan was bold, even visionary. Advance deep into North Korea. Capture Pyongyang. Destroy what remained of the Korean People's Army. Reach the Yalu River, the northernmost boundary of the peninsula, touching China. Reunify the country. End the war. But the terrain ahead was unlike anything the Allies had yet faced. Rugged mountains, narrow valleys, harsh cold. Roads turned to mud, then ice. Communication lines stretched dangerously thin. Supply chains lagged. Yet the momentum was unstoppable. City after city fell. Pyongyang, the North Korean capital, was taken on October 19th. It had once been the pride of the regime, its streets lined with red flags, its squares echoing with revolutionary songs. Now it was quiet. Fires smoldered in empty buildings. Statues lay shattered. Columns of refugees streamed northward, their eyes hollow with lost in the captured cities. The stories were grim. Survivors spoke of purges, executions, mass disappearances. Entire families dragged into the night. The North Korean regime, desperate to erase dissent, had ruled through terror. And now, as its grip weakened, its cruelty was laid bare. For a moment, a flicker in the vast scope of war, hope began to rise. Perhaps this really would end soon. Perhaps the country could be whole again. Soldiers wrote letters home. Commanders spoke of wrapping up by Christmas. Civilians dared to dream of peace. But in the north, in the cold shadows beyond the mountains, another force was watching. China, the People's Republic, only recently forged in civil war, had been warning for weeks. If UN troops approached the Yalu River, if foreign soldiers reached China's border, there would be consequences. The United States, believing China was bluffing, dismissed the threat. Intelligence reports were mixed. Some suggested Chinese units were massing near the border. Others claimed they would not risk direct confrontation. MacArthur himself was confident. He believed the war would end swiftly and that China would stay out. He was wronged as UN forces advanced into the northern provinces. Toward places like Sinaju, Chongjin, and Haisan, they encountered a land stripped bare. Bridges were destroyed. Roads were mined. Winter crept in from the north, biting harder with each mile. The Korean People's Army had retreated beyond the mountains, regrouping. But something else stirred beyond the Yalu. Still, the Allies pressed on. The U.S. 8th Army pushed northwest. The U.S. X-Corps, including the 1st Marine Division, moved east toward the Chosin Reservoir, a remote and treacherous region surrounded by icy peaks and narrow passes. The goal was clear: secure the border, wipe out remaining resistance, reunify the peninsula. But as they climbed further into the north, cracks began to form, logistics faltered, temperatures dropped below freezing. Troops fought frostbite and fuel shortages. Engines seized. Rifles jammed. Maps grew unreliable. What looked like the final sprint to victory was becoming a slow and grueling crawl. And then silence. The enemy was gone. Villages were empty. Roads were quiet. No gunfire. No resistance. For days, soldiers marched through ghost towns and forests without a fight. Some believed the North Koreans had given up. Others feared something worse, an ambush. But no one could be sure. Then, suddenly, they appeared on October 25, 1950, near the town of Unsan. U.S. and South Korean forces encountered something unexpected: soldiers dressed in unfamiliar uniforms, fighting with unusual tactics. Silent at day, swift at night. They were not North Koreans. They were Chinese. The Chinese People's Volunteer Army had crossed the Yalu River in secret, under cover of darkness and terrain. Tens of thousands, hidden in valleys, moving without vehicles, avoiding detection. Their orders were clear: drive the foreign invaders back. It was the beginning of a new phase in the war, one the Allies had not anticipated and were not prepared for. But that storm had yet to break. For now, in late October and early November, the UN forces celebrated their victories. Pyongyang was secure. North Korea's government was shattered. The vision of reunification seemed close, so close, it felt inevitable. In Washington, political leaders hailed MacArthur. In Tokyo, the general planned parades. In Seoul, Syngman Rhee prepared for the restoration of power. The press printed headlines like promises: war nearly won, Christmas at home. But inside the mountain passes, beneath falling snow and clouded breath, Chinese commanders drew their maps. They watched the valleys. They waited for the moment UN forces reached the edge of the Yalu. Looking across the river into Chinese territory, a quiet line had been crossed, not just on the ground, but in the minds of those who saw themselves not just as witnesses, but as guardians. The war had begun as a civil conflict. It had become a Cold War battleground. Now, it was on the edge of becoming something much larger. The Chinese were not bluffing. They were coming, but the world didn't know that. Not yet. For now, the mountains were still. The rivers froze. The soldiers advanced. Liberation had come to the south. Victory had followed to the north. And somewhere, high above the snow-covered ridges, beyond the rivers and valleys of war, history took a breath before plunging into fire again. Chapter 7. Warnings from the Dragon. The chill of late autumn settled across the Korean Peninsula. yet the flames of war burned hotter than ever. Across rugged mountains and frozen rivers, UN forces advanced relentlessly, their boots pounding. Deeper into enemy territory, their banners raised high over reclaimed cities. The momentum was on their side. Victory seemed inevitable, but beyond the jagged horizon, shadows lengthened in a land cloaked in secrecy and power. China, for months. The People's Republic of China had watched with growing alarm. The war, which began as a distant conflict on the Korean Peninsula, was edging closer to their doorstep. The presence of American troops near the Yalu River, the natural boundary between North Korea and China, was not just a military concern. It was a threat to the very security of the new Chinese state. Chinese leaders understood the stakes with chilling clarity. The U.S., they believed, sought not merely to repel the North Koreans, but to destroy the fledgling communist government that China had helped establish. The presence of foreign soldiers on China's border was unacceptable, warnings poured across diplomatic channels. The Chinese government issued public statements and secret communiques. They demanded the withdrawal of UN forces. They declared their readiness to defend their sovereignty. And yet, in Washington and Tokyo, these warnings were dismissed or downplayed. General Douglas MacArthur, the architect of the Incheon Landing and the man who had changed the course of the war, viewed China's threats with a mixture of skepticism and contempt. To him, the Chinese were bluffing. They lacked the will, the capacity, or the courage to intervene directly. "I do not believe the Chinese will come across the Yalu River," MacArthur insisted. His confidence was resolute, bordering on arrogance. "If they do, they will be mopped up like the North Koreans before them." His words echoed through military briefings and press conferences, bolstering the morale of Allied forces, but masking a dangerous underestimation. The intelligence told a different story. Chinese troops were already crossing the Yalu in secret. The People's Volunteer Army, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, moved silently through mountain passes and dense forests, hidden by darkness and fog. Their tactics were unconventional: guerrilla warfare, night attacks, and surprise ambushes. They were disciplined, fiercely motivated, and determined to protect their homeland at all costs. Yet these facts were often ignored or dismissed by U.S. intelligence. Reports of Chinese involvement were labeled as exaggerations or propaganda. The fear of expanding the war into China was palpable in Washington, but action was slow and cautious. Meanwhile, MacArthur prepared for what he believed was the final phase of the campaign. His plans focused on crushing the remaining North Korean forces, stabilizing the peninsula under South Korean control, and bringing an end to the conflict. But beneath the surface, the ground was shifting. In late October and early November 1950, Chinese forces launched a series of devastating surprise attacks. At the Battle of Unsan, UN troops were overwhelmed by a massive Chinese assault, suffering heavy casualties and forced into a chaotic retreat. The fighting was fierce, brutal, and unexpected, a clear sign that the war was entering a new, more dangerous phase. Despite these signs, MacArthur remained dismissive. He believed the Chinese would not risk a full-scale war with the United States. His focus was fixed on offensive operations, pushing deeper into North Korea. He urged Washington to authorize expanded bombing campaigns and even hinted at possible strikes against Chinese territory. This stance alarmed many in the U.S. government and military. President Truman and his advisors grappled with the delicate balance between defeating North Korea and avoiding a broader war with China or the Soviet Union. Truman sought to limit the conflict, emphasizing containment rather than conquest. But MacArthur's public statements grew more defiant. He challenged the administration's policies, advocating for a more aggressive approach. His warnings to China were blunt, even provocative. To some, he seemed to be pushing the war toward an inevitable clash with China, a gamble with consequences that few fully understood. Behind the scenes, diplomatic efforts continued, but trust between the U.S. and China was non-existent. Both sides prepared for war. The stage was set for a catastrophic confrontation, born of miscalculation, mistrust, and the fatal underestimation of a powerful adversary. As winter approached, the armies of the UN and China braced for one of the fiercest battles of the century. a battle that would test the limits of courage, endurance, and resolve on both sides of the Yalu River. Chapter 8. The Chinese Storm. The cold winds of November howled through the mountain passes and river valleys of northern Korea, carrying with them a sense of impending doom. The earth, already scarred by months of relentless fighting, seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere beyond the Yalu River, a force long whispered about was preparing to unleash its fury. The Chinese People's Volunteer Army, hundreds of thousands strong, surged into Korea under the cloak of darkness, obscured by swirling mists and the frozen night. This was not a mere ripple in the war. It was a tempest, a storm so fierce and sudden that it would reshape the battlefield and the fate of nations forever. For weeks, the Chinese had moved silently, their soldiers slipping through treacherous terrain with unyielding resolve. They traveled by foot, dragging equipment through snow and mud, avoiding detection, and striking fear into the hearts of those who caught fleeting glimpses of their columns. Their numbers were staggering. Estimates range from 200,000 to over 300,000 troops, an overwhelming force compared to the stretched and exhausted United Nations troops scattered across the peninsula. The first shock came swiftly to in late November 1950, near the Chosin Reservoir, a frozen, mountainous region known for its brutal winters. The U.S. Corps found itself surrounded. The Marines and soldiers, hardened by previous battles, faced an enemy unlike any they had imagined. The Chinese struck at night, moving with ghostly silence, encircling the Allied forces in a deadly embrace. The Battle of Chosin was a brutal testament to human endurance and the ferocity of war. Temperatures plummeted to -30 degrees Fahrenheit. Frostbite claimed more victims than bullets. Yet amid the icy Hell's Cape, men fought with a desperate determination. Outnumbered 10-1, the Marines fought their way through enemy lines in a brutal retreat known as the Frozen Chosin. Stories of courage and sacrifice emerged from the bitter landscape. Soldiers shielding their wounded comrades from artillery fire, medics braving death to carry the injured to safety, commanders coordinating withdrawals amid chaos and confusion. It was a fight for survival as much as for territory. Meanwhile, further south, other Chinese units launched massive offensives against UN positions along the entire front. Cities that had seemed secure were suddenly under siege. Supply lines were cut. Communication faltered. The once confident Allied troops were pushed back, often in disarray. The sheer scale and intensity of the Chinese assault stunned the world. The UN forces, which only weeks earlier had been advancing deep into North Korea, were now on the defensive. The tide of war had turned violently, swept away by the surge of the Chinese storm. General MacArthur, confronted with this unexpected ferocity, initially downplayed the threat. But as reports of staggering casualties and collapsing lines arrived, the reality became undeniable. The Chinese had not only entered the war, they had changed its course. Their strategy was both ruthless and effective. Using massed infantry, attacks, infiltration tactics, and intimate knowledge of the terrain, they neutralized UN advantages in firepower and air support. The mountains and forests became battlegrounds of relentless close-quarters combat, but the human cost was horrific on both sides. Villages were razed. Civilians caught in the crossfire fled or perished. The bitter cold claimed thousands. Exhaustion, hunger, and disease ravaged troops who fought not only an enemy but the elements themselves. As UN forces retreated southward, regrouping became a monumental task. Morale faltered. Leaders grappled with impossible decisions, whether to stand and fight or fall back and preserve their forces. The Chinese storm had arrived with a vengeance, sweeping through the Korean Peninsula with devastating speed and power. It was a turning point, one that revealed the brutal unpredictability of war and the deadly consequences of miscalculation. In the midst of frozen hills and bloodied valleys, the war had entered its darkest chapter, and the question hanging over every soldier, every commander, and every nation was simple yet terrifying. How far would this storm rage? And what would be left when it passed? Chapter 9. Retreat in the snow. Winter had descended on the Korean Peninsula with merciless cruelty. The cold was more than just a weather condition. It was an enemy in its own right, biting, unforgiving, and relentless. The snow blanketed the rugged mountains and frozen rivers, turning the landscape into a vast white graveyard where every breath became a battle, every step a struggle. It was into this frozen hell that United Nations forces found themselves retreating, forced back by the overwhelming tide of Chinese troops, battered and broken, fighting not just for ground, but for survival. The retreat was unlike anything the U.S. military had ever faced, the longest withdrawal in its history. Stretching over hundreds of miles, it was a harrowing journey marked by exhaustion, loss, and moments of profound courage. Soldiers marched through bone-chilling cold, their faces frozen, their bodies numb, dragging heavy packs and wounded comrades through deep snow and treacherous ice. Guns jammed, vehicles stalled, and supplies dwindled. Each day brought new hardships. Frostbite claimed more lives than enemy fire. Yet, despite the bitter conditions, the men pressed on. The center of this desperate retreat was the 1st Marine Division, surrounded near the Chosin Reservoir, a remote and mountainous region that became a crucible of endurance and sacrifice. Encircled by tens of thousands of Chinese soldiers, the Marines faced near impossible odds. Their supply lines were cut, and the bitter cold was as deadly as the enemy's bullets. Yet, with unyielding discipline and fierce determination, they fought their way through the snow-clad mountains, inflicting heavy casualties and rescuing their wounded comrades. The frozen Chosin became a symbol of courage against overwhelming adversity. Meanwhile, other UN units faced similar ordeals. Across the front, retreating through narrow mountain passes and devastated towns, they were constantly harassed by Chinese forces using guerrilla tactics, ambushes, night attacks, and relentless pursuit. Commanders had to balance the need for speed with the safety of their troops, often making heartbreaking decisions to leave behind the wounded or abandon equipment to avoid total annihilation. The logistical nightmare was staggering. Roads became impassable, bridges were destroyed to slow the enemy, fuel and ammunition ran perilously low, medical supplies dwindled, and the cold made treating wounds nearly impossible. Soldiers wrapped in multiple layers still succumbed to hypothermia and frostbite. The sound of artillery and small arms fire was punctuated by the groans of the wounded and the crackling of frozen limbs. Despite these dire conditions, stories of heroism emerged. Medics risked their lives to reach the injured. Officers led rearguard actions to hold off pursuing forces. Small units fought delaying actions, buying time for the main body to withdraw. Soldiers shared scarce food and warmth, comforting each other through the long nights. Letters home spoke not only of fear and hardship, but also of brotherhood and resolve. The political and military leadership faced intense pressure as the retreat unfolded. Public opinion in the United States and allied nations wavered. The hope for a swift victory faded, replaced by grim determination to preserve what remained. Debates raged over strategy, command decisions, and the future of the war. Yet, amidst the chaos and cold, the retreat was not a rout. It was a calculated withdrawal, a strategic maneuver to regroup, reinforce, and prepare for the battles yet to come. The UN forces, though battered, lived to fight another day. As the snow continued to fall and the bitter wind howled through the hills, the men who endured the retreat in the snow etched their story into history, a testament to resilience, sacrifice, and the unbreakable spirit of those who faced the darkest of winters and refused to surrender. Chapter 10. Seoul Falls Again. The city of Seoul had always been a prize of immense symbolic and strategic value. Twice it had been seized, twice it had slipped from one side to the other in the relentless tide of the Korean War. And now, in the bleak early months of 1951, the capital was about to fall once again, swallowed by the encroaching shadow of communist forces. The streets of Seoul, once vibrant with life and culture, were now scarred by months of occupation, battle, and destruction. Buildings stood shattered, windows blown out by shellfire. The air was thick with smoke, dust, and the lingering scent of fear. Civilians, caught in the crossfire, fled, or hid, their faces etched with exhaustion and uncertainty. The city's heartbeat had slowed, stuttering under the weight of war. After the Chinese and North Korean offensives forced the United Nations troops into a bitter retreat during the winter, Seoul became the focal point of a terrifying advance. With UN forces pushed back, their lines stretched thin and morale shaken, Communist forces surged forward with brutal efficiency. They had learned from earlier campaigns, using overwhelming numbers, night attacks, and infiltration tactics to confuse and disorient defenders. By late January, the situation for the defenders of Seoul grew increasingly dire. The city's perimeter defenses, hastily constructed, under-resourced, and manned by weary soldiers, buckled under constant pressure. Supply lines were strained, reinforcements delayed, communications faltered. Panic began to seep into the ranks. The battle for Seoul was not just a clash of armies. It was a struggle for the soul of a nation, a test of resilience for its people. As communist forces approached the city, UN commanders faced agonizing decisions. Holding Seoul was vital, but at what cost? Civilians were trapped in the crossfire, and the risk of a devastating urban battle loomed large. Orders to withdraw were reluctantly given, sparking confusion and urgency among the defenders. The withdrawal was chaotic. Soldiers and civilians alike scrambled to escape the advancing forces. Roads clogged with vehicles and refugees stretched for miles. The cries of the wounded and the terrified filled the cold winter air. Families were separated, possessions abandoned. The city that had seen so much violence was on the verge of falling into enemy hands once more. That on January 4, 1951, communist troops entered Seoul. Their banners rose over the city once again, signaling a dark moment for South Korea. For many, it was a crushing blow, a reminder of the war's relentless cruelty and the precariousness of hope. But the capture of Seoul also marked a turning point. The resilience of the defenders, the sacrifices made during the retreat, and the determination to reclaim the city would fuel the counteroffensives that followed. The war was far from over in the streets of Seoul, amidst the ruins and shadows. The people endured. They faced fear with courage, loss with resolve. The city's fall was not an end, but a chapter, a testament to the costs of war and the enduring spirit of a nation fighting to define its future. Chapter 11. The Frozen Hell of Chosin. The bitter cold descended with unforgiving cruelty upon the rugged mountains surrounding the Chosin Reservoir. It was a landscape carved by glaciers, now buried beneath ice and snow. The biting wind sliced through the ranks of soldiers, while the mercury plunged to bone-numbing lows, far below anything these men had ever endured. Here, in this frozen hell, the fate of the United States 1st Marine Division, and, arguably, the entire United Nations mission in Korea, would be forged in a crucible of fire, ice, and sheer will. In late November 1950, the Marines found themselves encircled, isolated deep behind enemy lines, cut off from reinforcements and supply. Facing them was an overwhelming force of Chinese troops, fierce, determined, and seemingly endless in number. The Chinese People's Volunteer Army had emerged from the shadows, descending upon the Marines with brutal night attacks, relentless ambushes, and massed infantry assaults. What followed was one of the most harrowing and heroic engagements in modern military history. A battle of endurance and courage now known simply as the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir. The Marines had advanced into North Korea with confidence, buoyed by earlier victories. But the icy mountains around the reservoir were a trap, a vast natural fortress that the Chinese used to devastating effect. As the weather turned bitter and the first snow fell, the Marines began to realize the magnitude of the peril they faced. Temperatures dropped to as low as -35 degrees Fahrenheit, and frostbite became as deadly as enemy bullets. The cold froze weapons, jammed machinery, and numbed fingers to the point that pulling a trigger was a challenge in itself. Yet, despite these conditions, the Marines fought with fierce determination. They dug in, their foxholes carved into frozen earth, huddled together for warmth and strength. When the Chinese attacked at night, the Marines responded with disciplined volleys of fire, calling in airstrikes and artillery barrages. The darkness was pierced by tracer rounds and the roar of explosions. Each inch of ground was fought over, with brutal hand-to-hand combat, as the enemy sought to overwhelm by sheer weight of numbers. The terrain was a nightmare. Narrow mountain roads twisted dangerously, supply routes were precarious, and visibility was often near zero. Yet, under the command of leaders who refused to concede defeat, the Marines began a fighting withdrawal, a desperate, methodical march to the port of Hungnam, where evacuation awaited. The retreat was a nightmare. Snow and ice made every step treacherous. Trucks and tanks slipped and crashed. The wounded had to be carried over frozen ground, under constant threat from enemy snipers and artillery. The air was thin and the exhaustion palpable. Many soldiers suffered frostbite so severe it required amputation. Still, the Marines pressed on, covering each other, setting up rearguard actions that bought precious time. In this frozen hell, acts of extraordinary bravery unfolded. Medics braved enemy fire to treat the wounded. Officers rallied scattered units. Soldiers shared their last rations and clothing with comrades. Despite dwindling supplies and overwhelming odds, morale held. The bond between these men was unbreakable. Forged in the fires of shared hardship, they fought their way southward. The Marines inflicted severe losses on the Chinese forces. Their superior training, coordination, and firepower turned the tide against overwhelming numbers. The Chinese learned quickly that their enemy was not just the cold and terrain, but the indomitable spirit of the Marines. Finally, after weeks of grueling combat and retreat, the battered but unbroken 1st Marine Division reached the port of Hungnam. Here, under the harsh winter sky, the Marines were evacuated by sea, leaving behind the frozen mountains but carrying with them a legacy of resilience and valor. The Battle of Chosin Reservoir stands as a testament to human endurance against impossible odds. It was a story not just of military strategy or tactics, but of courage, sacrifice, and brotherhood in the face of overwhelming adversity. For the men who fought there, the frozen hell was a crucible, one that would shape their lives and echo through history as a symbol of resolve and honor in the darkest of times. Chapter 12. The New Commander. The Korean War had become a crucible of power, politics, and military strategy, a battlefield not only of armies, but of clashing wills and visions. At its heart was a growing rift between two towering figures: President Harry S. Truman, the leader of the free world, and General Douglas MacArthur, the resolute commander whose bold actions had both shaped and complicated the conflict. Their clash would culminate in a dramatic turning point: the relief of MacArthur from his command, and the rise of a new leader to steer the embattled United Nations forces through one of their darkest hours. General Douglas MacArthur was a man of legend. His reputation was forged in the fires of World War II, where he had led the liberation of the Philippines and commanded the Allied forces in the Pacific. His confidence was unshakable, his vision grand. When the Korean War erupted, MacArthur's daring amphibious landing at Incheon had reversed the tide, earning him praise and adulation. Yet beneath the triumph, tensions simmered. MacArthur's approach was aggressive, focused on total victory. He believed the war should not merely repel North Korean aggression, but decisively defeat the communist forces, even if that meant expanding the conflict beyond Korea's borders. He advocated bombing Chinese bases, blockading ports, and even hinted at using nuclear weapons. Such boldness unsettled the Truman administration, which sought to contain the conflict and avoid a wider war with China or the Soviet Union. The tension between political leadership and military command grew increasingly public and bitter. MacArthur openly challenged Truman's policies, making statements that contradicted official government positions and undermined civilian control over the military. His refusal to heed warnings about Chinese involvement, combined with his calls for escalation, strained relations to a breaking point. On April 11, 1951, the inevitable happened. President Truman, asserting the principle of civilian supremacy over the military, relieved General MacArthur of his command. The decision shocked the nation and the world. To many, MacArthur was a hero, a symbol of American strength and resolve. To others, his defiance threatened the delicate balance of power and the careful diplomacy required in a complex Cold War environment. The news was met with a whirlwind of reactions. Congress debated, newspapers debated, and citizens voiced passionate opinions. Some saw Truman's move as necessary to maintain control over foreign policy. Others viewed it as a betrayal of a military icon. The episode highlighted the profound challenges of waging limited war in an era of global tension. Into this breach stepped General Matthew Ridgway, a steady and unassuming leader known for his calm demeanor and tactical skill. Ridgway had commanded the 82nd Airborne Division in World War II and was respected for his ability to inspire troops and restore discipline. Tasked with replacing MacArthur, Ridgway faced a daunting challenge: reviving the morale of battered forces, stabilizing a volatile front, and navigating the complex political landscape. That Ridgway's arrival marked a shift in tone and strategy. He emphasized pragmatic leadership, focusing on rebuilding the fighting spirit of UN troops and improving their conditions in the harsh Korean terrain. Unlike MacArthur's sweeping visions, Ridgway's approach was grounded in realism and adaptability. His first days in command were spent assessing the shattered front lines and meeting with commanders and soldiers. He listened to their concerns, recognized their sacrifices, and instilled a renewed sense of purpose. Where despair and fatigue had taken root, Ridgway sought to plant seeds of resilience and determination. Under Ridgway's leadership, UN forces began to stabilize. Defensive lines were strengthened. Counteroffensives were planned with careful consideration of terrain, weather, and enemy capabilities. His respect for both the troops and the limits of the conflict earned him loyalty and admiration. Yet Ridgway also understood the broader stakes. The Korean War was not just a battle of armies. It was a conflict entangled with Cold War politics, alliances, and the precarious balance between war and peace. Navigating these waters required diplomacy as much as military skill. As the new commander settled into his role, the Korean Peninsula remained a land of uncertainty, scarred by conflict, caught between superpowers, and inhabited by millions yearning for peace. Ridgway's steady hand would guide the UN forces through this turbulent phase, seeking to turn back the tide and restore stability. The removal of MacArthur and the appointment of Ridgway was more than a change in command. It was a moment that underscored the complexities of leadership in war, the tensions between military ambition and political reality, the sacrifices demanded by conflict, and the enduring hope for resolution. In the months that followed, Ridgway's leadership would prove vital in shaping the course of the Korean War. His ability to inspire, to adapt, and to command respect laid the groundwork for future operations and helped restore confidence in a conflict that had seemed increasingly uncertain. The story of this transition is a reminder that war is not just fought on battlefields, but within the corridors of power, where decisions carry profound consequences. And in the frozen mountains and dusty towns of Korea, the new commander's presence brought a cautious but crucial hope, a chance to persevere against daunting odds, and a step toward eventual peace. Chapter 13. Holding the Line. The bitter winds of early spring swept over the rugged hills and battered towns of the Korean Peninsula. After months of relentless combat, devastating retreats, and hard-fought victories, the battlefront was finally settling into a grim, unforgiving rhythm. Near the 38th parallel, the invisible line that had once divided a peaceful peninsula but now symbolized a fractured nation, United Nations forces had pushed back against the tide of communist advances, re-establishing a tenuous but resolute front. What followed was a transformation of the war itself, a grinding stalemate, where gains were measured not in miles or cities, but in inches and days. The months leading up to this moment had tested the very limits of endurance and leadership. After the harrowing withdrawal from the Chosin Reservoir and the second Fall of Seoul, morale had been shattered. But under the command of General Matthew Ridgway, the United Nations troops, composed primarily of American, South Korean, British, Canadian, Turkish, and other allied soldiers, had been given a renewed purpose. Ridgway understood that the War was no longer about swift victories or grand offensives. It was about survival, resilience, and maintaining the line. By the spring of 1951, the chaotic retreats and advances that had characterized the war's early months gave way to deliberate, methodical operations. The front line stabilized. Trenches were dug deep into the cold earth. Bunkers were reinforced with steel and sandbags. Every hilltop, every ridge, every village became a potential battlefield, fiercely contested by both sides. The 38th parallel, once a political boundary, had transformed into a fortress line, a bloody scar across Korea's heart. Here, soldiers faced the cold calculus of attrition, where each day brought artillery barges, patrol clashes, and sniper duels. In the dense forests and jagged mountains, patrols crept forward under the cloak of darkness, probing enemy positions, gathering intelligence, and occasionally sparking fierce firefights that flared briefly before fading back into tense silence. The terrain was merciless. Steep slopes, hidden mines, and freezing temperatures added layers of hardship to an already brutal conflict. Soldiers battled not only the enemy, but frostbite, disease, and exhaustion. Yet amid these trials, moments of humanity and camaraderie emerged. Letters passed between comrades, shared meals in cold foxholes, and quiet reflections under star-filled skies. The war's strategic focus shifted. The ambitious goal of reunifying Korea under one government was replaced by the grim reality of holding territory and preventing further loss. Both sides dug in, knowing that neither could easily dislodge the other without tremendous cost. UN forces, benefiting from superior air power and logistics, sought to maintain pressure while minimizing unnecessary risk. Airstrikes targeted supply routes and enemy concentrations, yet commanders remained cautious to avoid escalation, aware that the war's shadow extended far beyond Korea's borders into the tense arenas of the Cold War. On the opposing side, Chinese and North Korean forces displayed equal determination. Their troops adapted to the grueling conditions, using tunnel networks, night assaults, and propaganda to sustain their war effort. Both sides understood that this was no longer a war of movement, but a war of attrition, each seeking to wear down the other's will. The stalemate produced profound consequences for the soldiers and civilians caught in its grip. For frontline troops, daily life was a relentless cycle of alertness and waiting, watching for enemy movement, enduring artillery bombardments, and surviving bitter winters and sweltering summers. The psychological toll was immense, with many struggling to find meaning in the endless grinding conflict. For the Korean people, the prolonged fighting brought devastation. Towns were destroyed, farmlands ruined, and families torn apart. Refugees swelled, flooding into cities or across borders, seeking safety from a war that seemed endless. Yet, even in this bleak period, glimmers of hope and humanity persisted. Soldiers forged bonds across nationalities, sharing stories, food, and music. Local communities rebuilt where they could, and international aid sought to ease the suffering. The war's stalemate also spurred diplomatic efforts. Behind the scenes, negotiators from both sides began tentative talks aimed at ending the conflict. Yet, the path to peace was obstructed by deep mistrust, political complexities, and the fierce desire to secure strategic advantage. The front near the 38th parallel became a theater of endurance, where the valor of individuals, infantrymen, medics, engineers, and commanders defined the war's character. It was a reminder that history is not only shaped by sweeping campaigns and grand strategies, but by the daily struggles of those who hold the line in the face of adversity. In this frozen, rugged landscape, the Korean War settled into its long, grinding middle phase, a stalemate that would persist for years, testing the limits of human will and forever marking the peninsula with the scars of conflict and the hope for eventual peace. Chapter 14: A War of Hills and Trenches. As the Korean War ground into its second year, the nature of the conflict shifted dramatically. What had begun as a war of swift advances and desperate retreats, a contest of armored thrusts and airborne assaults, slowly transformed into something altogether more grim and unyielding. The battlefields became dominated by a brutal, grinding form of warfare, a war of hills and trenches. Gone were the sweeping maneuvers and bold landings that had marked the early months. Instead, soldiers found themselves locked in a cycle of relentless assaults, bitter counterattacks, and desperate defenses, clinging to a landscape carved into countless ridges, hills, and fortified positions. It was a battlefield reminiscent of the mud-soaked trenches of World War I, static, deadly, and marked by a devastating human toll over terrain often devoid of strategic value. The hills of Korea were more than just topographical features. They were symbols of control, pride, and survival. Each knoll, ridge, or mound might be just a few meters high, a seemingly insignificant rise in the rugged terrain. But to the men who fought for them, these heights were everything. Holding the high ground meant observation, artillery advantage, and a sliver of safety in a war where death lurked in every shadow. These battles were often bloody, violent, and seemingly futile. Control of a hill might change hands dozens of times in a matter of days or even hours. Troops would charge across open ground, enduring withering fire, to take a fortified position. When successful, they would dig in immediately, preparing for the inevitable counterattack. Trenches were carved deep into frozen earth or dug frantically into rocky soil. Sandbags, barbed wire, and minefields transformed the landscape into a deadly maze. Artillery bombardments and mortar fire were constant, turning hillsides into craters and sending clouds of smoke and debris into the air. The deafening roar of gunfire was punctuated by the cries of the wounded and the grim determination of soldiers refusing to yield. For the infantrymen, the foot soldiers, these engagements were harrowing. They fought in knee-deep mud or ankle-deep snow, with equipment heavy and movement difficult. The cold winters bit through their uniforms, while summer brought sweltering heat and relentless insects. Sleep was scarce, food and water often rationed. Yet despite the misery, soldiers endured, motivated by camaraderie, duty, and the hope that each bloody battle might bring them closer to an end. Medical support struggled to keep pace with the relentless casualties. Field hospitals operated under fire, treating wounds amid chaos. Evacuation routes were perilous, and many wounded soldiers faced long, painful journeys before reaching safety. Leadership played a crucial role in this attritional warfare. Officers and non-commissioned officers were tasked not only with planning assaults, but also with sustaining morale amid grinding losses. Orders to take that hill often came with full knowledge of the risks. Yet, commanders recognized that holding key terrain was vital to the broader defensive lines. Psychologically, the war of hills and trenches wore heavily on soldiers. The constant threat of enemy fire, the monotony of trench life, and the terror of assaults created a mental strain often as brutal as the physical one. Letters home spoke of fear, hope, and the profound bonds formed under fire. The broader strategic picture was sobering. Neither side could gain decisive advantage through these costly battles. The front lines shifted little, locked in a stalemate, where every gain was paid for in blood and every inch of ground fiercely contested. This style of warfare also reflected the political constraints of the Korean War. The United Nations Command sought to avoid escalating the conflict into a wider war, particularly with China or the Soviet Union. Thus, large-scale offensives were tempered, and fighting became a war of attrition, grinding down the enemy's resources, morale, and will to fight. For the Korean people, these battles brought devastation to their land and lives. Villages near the front lines were destroyed or abandoned. Farmers' fields became battlefields. Civilians were caught in the crossfire, forced to flee or endure hardship. Refugee crises swelled, and the social fabric of the peninsula frayed under the weight of war. Yet amidst the hardship, moments of humanity shone through. Soldiers shared rations, helped bury the dead, and showed acts of kindness to local civilians. Music, letters, and stories traveled between trenches, offering brief respite from the horror. The War of Hills and Trenches was a testament to the brutal reality of the Korean conflict, a stark reminder that in war, ground is often measured, not just by its strategic value, but by the price paid to hold it. It was a war defined by sacrifice, endurance, and the relentless struggle of individuals caught in the gears of a larger geopolitical machine. As the battle for Korea settled into this unyielding pattern, the soldiers who fought on those hills embodied the tenacity and tragedy of a war that would shape the course of history and the lives of millions. Chapter 15: Thunder from the Skies. Above the rugged mountains and war-torn plains of Korea, another battle raged, fierce, swift, and unlike any before. The skies became a vast arena where roaring engines, flashing gunfire, and blazing trails of smoke told a story of technological innovation, human courage, and deadly confrontation. This was the air war over Korea, a clash that introduced jet-powered dogfights, transformed strategic bombing, and left an indelible mark on the history of aerial combat. From the earliest days of the conflict, control of the skies was crucial. The United Nations forces, led by the United States, deployed an impressive array of aircraft to gain air superiority, provide close air support to ground troops, and carry out strategic bombing campaigns. The centerpiece of the U.S. aerial fleet was the B-29 Superfortress, a 4-engine heavy bomber that had proven its devastating power in World War II. The B-29s thundered over Korea with their massive payloads of bombs, targeting enemy supply lines, transportation networks, industrial centers, and troop concentrations. Their missions were perilous. Flying at high altitudes, often under heavy anti-aircraft fire and the threat of enemy fighters, crews faced extreme danger. Yet, their raids inflicted significant damage on the North Korean and Chinese war efforts, disrupting logistics and exerting psychological pressure. But the skies over Korea were far from uncontested. Soviet-built MiG-15 jet fighters, flown by North Korean, Chinese, and Soviet pilots, posed a formidable threat. These sleek, powerful jets ushered in a new era of air combat, capable of high speeds and deadly maneuverability. The airspace over Northwest Korea, near the Yalu River and Chinese border, became famously known as MiG Alley, the site of some of the fiercest and most historic aerial duels ever witnessed. For the first time in history, jet-to-jet dogfights were fought at supersonic speeds and dizzying altitudes. The U.S. Air Force deployed its own jet fighters, notably the F-86 Sabre, to counter the MiG menace. Pilots on both sides were skilled, courageous, and aware that each encounter could be their last. The dogfights over MiG Alley were breathtaking. Displays of skill and nerve. Pilots twisted and turned through clouds and mountains, chasing each other in high-speed spirals, firing bursts of machine gun fire and rockets. The roar of jet engines and the flash of tracer bullets filled the sky. Each victory or loss was measured not only in aircraft destroyed, but in the survival of a single pilot, a young man thousands of miles from home, facing death in the thin air above a foreign land. Stories of these pilots reveal a complex picture of bravery and tragedy. Many were seasoned veterans. Others were fresh-faced newcomers. They flew missions that tested the limits of their machines and their own endurance. Pilots formed deep bonds, aware that camaraderie might be their only shield against the cold. In different sky, the air war also brought new challenges. Weather in Korea was unpredictable and often harsh. Fog, snow, and rain grounded many sorties. Mechanical failures were frequent. Pilots risked not only enemy fire but also the perils of high-altitude flight and malfunctioning equipment. Strategically, air power became an essential component of the UN war effort. Bombing campaigns aimed to sever enemy supply lines, destroy infrastructure, and weaken morale. Close air support provided crucial assistance to ground troops, striking enemy positions that were otherwise inaccessible. Reconnaissance planes gathered vital intelligence, guiding commanders' decisions on the ground, but the air war was not without controversy. The destruction wrought by bombing raids often affected civilians, leading to debates about the ethics of strategic bombing and the conduct of the war. The challenge of distinguishing military targets from civilian areas was an ongoing concern. complicated by the nature of guerrilla warfare and the dense population of the Korean Peninsula. Despite these difficulties, the pilots who took to the skies over Korea demonstrated remarkable skill and determination. Their battles pushed aviation technology forward, setting new standards for speed, maneuverability, and combat tactics. The jet age had arrived in earnest, and Korea was its proving ground. As the war dragged on, the skies remained fiercely contested. Neither side could claim total dominance, and air superiority shifted with each engagement. Yet, the presence of powerful air forces shaped the ground war, providing both sides with hope, fear, and the capacity to strike far beyond the front lines. The thunder from the skies was a defining feature of the Korean War, a brutal, high-speed ballet of death and survival, innovation and tradition. It was a testament to the courage of those who flew into danger, the advances of modern technology, and the ever-changing face of warfare. Above the hills and trenches, in the roar of jet engines and the flash of tracer fire, the air wore over. Korea wrote a chapter of history marked by bravery, innovation, and the relentless pursuit of victory amid the chaos of conflict. Chapter 16: Propaganda and Psyops. War is fought not only with weapons, but also with words, with ideas, symbols, and the unseen forces of the mind. In the Korean War, as bullets tore through flesh and artillery shattered earth, another battle unfolded. One fought with leaflets drifting on the wind, loudspeakers blaring messages across no man's land, and carefully crafted narratives designed to fracture enemy morale and win the loyalty of civilians. This was the war for hearts and minds, a psychological battle as crucial and complex as any fought with guns and tanks. From the earliest days of the conflict, both sides recognized that the human mind was a powerful battlefield. The stakes were high. If soldiers could be demoralized, if civilians could be persuaded, if the enemy's will to fight could be weakened, then victory might be achieved without a single bullet fired. The ideological struggle between communism and democracy, between North and South, was waged not only in trenches and hills, but also in newspapers, radios, and the whisper of falling paper. Leaflets were among the most visible tools of psychological warfare. Tens of millions of these thin sheets of paper, printed in Korean, English, Chinese, and other languages, were dropped from aircraft, scattered by the wind over enemy lines and civilian areas. They carried messages that ranged from warnings of impending attacks to appeals for surrender to promises of humane treatment and future prosperity. Some leaflets were blunt and direct. Others employed humor or fear. Still others used religious and cultural references to resonate deeply with their audiences. Soldiers on the front lines would pick up these fluttering scraps of paper, reading words that tried to reach beyond the battlefield. "Surrender now and live," one leaflet might plead. "Your government lies to you," another declared. The intent was clear: to sow doubt, to weaken resolve, and to encourage desertion or defection. Yet, the effectiveness of leaflets varied widely. For some, they offered a glimmer of hope. For others, they were dismissed as enemy propaganda. Loudspeakers became another weapon in the psychological arsenal. Mounted on trucks, helicopters, or carried by infantry, these devices projected voices across the rugged terrain and quiet valleys. From dawn to dusk, and sometimes through the long, eerie hours of night, voices would carry over no man's land, broadcasting messages aimed at enemy soldiers and civilians alike. The broadcasts varied in tone and content. They ranged from urgent warnings to rallying calls, from promises of mercy to threats of overwhelming retaliation. Songs, stories, and speeches filled the airwaves, designed to comfort friendly forces and unsettle foes. The voices were often professional broadcasters or psychological warfare specialists trained in persuasion and influence. Soldiers on both sides reported mixed reactions. Some were unnerved by the constant presence of unseen voices. Others found solace in the messages of hope. But the psychological impact was undeniable. The loudspeakers blurred the line between battlefield and mindscape, reminding all that war was fought not only in the trenches, but also in the depths of fear and hope, Beyond leaflets and loudspeakers, more subtle and complex psychological operations were conducted. Intelligence agencies and propaganda bureaus worked to create and spread stories that shaped perceptions. Radio broadcasts, newspapers, and posters were carefully controlled and manipulated to present narratives favorable to their cause. In South Korea, UN forces and the South Korean government sought to bolster support among the population by highlighting the atrocities committed by North Korean and Chinese forces. Graphic accounts of massacres, torture, and forced labor were disseminated to stoke outrage and resistance. Conversely, the North used propaganda to emphasize the unity of the communist cause, portraying their struggle as one of liberation and justice. This psychological battle was complicated by cultural and linguistic differences, making messaging a delicate art. Efforts were made to tailor propaganda to local traditions, religious beliefs, and historical grievances. Religious figures were sometimes enlisted to deliver messages. Local folklore was woven into broadcasts, and imagery was crafted to resonate emotionally. But propaganda was a double-edged sword. Missteps or exaggerations could alienate populations, harden resistance, or provoke backlash. Both sides grappled with maintaining credibility while pursuing their psychological objectives. The fog of war often clouded the truth, and competing narratives created confusion and mistrust. The psychological war extended beyond Korea's borders, reaching international audiences. Both communist and Western powers used media to influence global opinion, rally allies, and isolate opponents. The Korean War thus became a stage for the Cold War's ideological contest, with each side seeking to demonstrate moral superiority and the righteousness of their cause. For the individual soldiers and civilians caught in this swirling storm of words and images, the psychological operations added layers of complexity to an already brutal conflict. The constant barrage of messages challenged their beliefs, tested their loyalties, and sometimes offered the slenderest thread of hope amidst despair. The war for hearts and minds was never merely a sideshow. It shaped morale, influenced decisions, and at times, determined outcomes on the ground. It was a reminder that in war, victory is as much about winning the trust and spirit of people as it is about capturing territory or defeating armies. As leaflets drifted down from the skies and voices echoed across the hills, the Korean War's psychological battlefield unfolded, invisible yet potent, subtle yet savage. A struggle for human minds amidst the carnage and chaos of a war that would leave an enduring legacy on the peninsula and the world. Chapter 17. The Prisoners of Hell. War does not end at the battlefield. It continues behind barbed wire fences and in shadowed prison camps, where the fate of captured soldiers becomes a grim testament to the cruelty and complexity of conflict. In the Korean War, the plight of prisoners of war, on both sides, emerged as one of the most harrowing and contentious chapters, earning the somber title, The Prisoners of Hell. Their suffering, endurance, and the political dilemmas surrounding them would shape not only the lives of thousands, but also the fragile prospects for peace. From the earliest clashes in 1950, soldiers found themselves captured amidst the chaos of rapidly shifting front lines. For those taken prisoner by the North Korean and Chinese forces, the journey often began with forced marches through mountainous terrain, sometimes lasting days under brutal conditions. Starvation, exposure, disease, and physical abuse were common. Many prisoners were held in camps nestled deep within rugged valleys or behind heavily guarded fortifications, places where the outside world seemed impossibly distant. The camps were infamous for their harsh conditions. Barracks were overcrowded, unsanitary, and poorly supplied. Food rations were meager, malnutrition was rampant. Medical care was scarce or non-existent, leading to high mortality rates from wounds, illness, and neglect. Beyond physical suffering, prisoners endured psychological torment, isolation, uncertainty, and the constant threat of violence. Attempts to resist or escape were met with brutal reprisals. Yet, amidst this hellish existence, many prisoners found ways to survive through camaraderie, quiet acts of defiance, and sheer willpower. Secret meetings were held to maintain morale, share news, and organize resistance. Stories of heroism emerged. A medic risking punishment to treat a wounded comrade. A group sustaining hope through whispered prayers and songs. A prisoner sacrificing himself to save others that on the other side. United Nations forces also took tens of thousands of North Korean and Chinese soldiers prisoner. While their camps were generally better supplied, challenges persisted. The issue of prisoner repatriation became a contentious and deeply divisive matter. Many prisoners from the communist side expressed a strong desire not to return to their homelands, fearing persecution, imprisonment, or death. This complicated negotiations and fueled mistrust. The prisoner issue quickly became a major obstacle to peace talks. As armistice negotiations began in 1951, the fate of prisoners dominated discussions. The communist side insisted on the immediate and unconditional repatriation of all prisoners, while the United Nations advocated for voluntary repatriation, a principle recognizing the rights of prisoners to refuse return if they feared persecution. This impasse prolonged negotiations for nearly 2 years. The camps, meanwhile, became spaces of uncertainty and despair, where prisoners were caught not only between warring armies, but between the complex tides of international diplomacy. The political significance of the prisoner issue reflected the broader ideological conflict of the Cold War. For both sides, prisoners represented more than captured soldiers. They symbolized victory, loyalty, and the righteousness of cause. The refusal of some prisoners to return was exploited as propaganda, portrayed as proof of the moral superiority or oppression inherent in each system. Meanwhile, the humanitarian crisis deepened. Reports emerged of prisoner mistreatment, forced indoctrination, and executions. International organizations, including the Red Cross, sought access and oversight, but their efforts were often limited by the hostility and secrecy surrounding the camps. The experiences of prisoners varied widely. Some endured unimaginable suffering, yet survived to tell their stories of endurance, loss, hope, and tragedy. Others perished, their fates lost to the cold records of war. The prisoner of war camps became microcosms of the Korean War's brutal reality, places where humanity was tested, broken, and, sometimes, reaffirmed. They highlighted the war's human cost beyond the battlefield and underscored the profound challenges of achieving peace amid deep divisions. As armistice talks dragged on, the prisoner issue remained central, a painful reminder that even as guns fell silent, the wounds of war would not easily heal. It was a conflict not only of armies but of ideologies, of loyalty and conscience, and of the basic human rights of those caught in the machinery of war. The legacy of the prisoners of hell endures, a somber testament to sacrifice and suffering, and a powerful reminder of the enduring need for compassion, justice, and peace in times of conflict. Chapter 18. The Peace That Wouldn't Come. In the summer of 1951, amid the endless snow-covered hills and trenches that scarred the Korean Peninsula, a fragile hope flickered, the hope of peace. After nearly a year of devastating combat, immense suffering, and staggering loss, the combatants agreed to sit at a negotiating table. The promise of ceasefire talks stirred a cautious optimism among soldiers, civilians, and leaders alike. But what began as a hopeful step toward ending the bloodshed soon revealed itself as a grueling, protracted struggle, a peace that wouldn't come. The armistice talks commenced at Kaesong, later moving to the village of Panmunjom, near the 38th parallel, the very line that had become the war's de facto border. Delegates from the United Nations Command, North Korea, and China faced one another across the table, each representing deeply entrenched positions hardened by years of war and ideological conflict. From the outset, the negotiations were fraught with tension. The central issues were complex and emotionally charged: prisoner repatriation, the demarcation of borders, and the establishment of a lasting peace framework. Each side was wary of making concessions that might undermine its position or betray the sacrifices made on the battlefield. One of the most contentious points was the fate of prisoners of war. The communist side demanded the immediate and unconditional return of all prisoners, while the United Nations insisted on voluntary repatriation, honoring the right of prisoners to choose their own fate. This seemingly technical issue symbolized larger struggles over sovereignty, ideology, and human rights. It would stall progress and prolong the talks for nearly 2 years. Throughout the drawn-out negotiations, the fighting on the ground did not cease. Battles continued, artillery roared, and soldiers endured the relentless hardship of frontline service. The war and the peace talks existed in a paradoxical tension, the horrors of combat intertwined with the cautious hope of diplomacy. Diplomats and military leaders grappled with frustration and despair. Some saw the negotiations as a vital opportunity to end the conflict and save lives. Others viewed them as a stalemate, a charade masking deep divisions that might never be bridged. The global stakes were immense. The Korean War had become a Cold War proxy, and the outcomes at Panmunjom would resonate far beyond the peninsula. The protracted talks wore heavily on all involved. Delegates endured long sessions, heated arguments, and moments of near collapse. The pressure of representing nations, ideologies, and millions of lives weighed heavily on their shoulders. Outside the conference rooms, the people of Korea waited and hoped. Families torn apart, refugees displaced, communities shattered. Attempts to break the deadlock came in many forms: secret negotiations, confidence-building measures, and proposals for phased withdrawals. But each breakthrough was met with new obstacles, misunderstandings, and political maneuvering. The war's bitterness was etched deeply into every stance and statement. Meanwhile, the world watched anxiously. News of the talks filtered through international media, shaping perceptions of the conflict and its possible resolution. The United Nations member states, the Soviet Union, China, and the United States all played their roles, balancing domestic pressures, strategic interests, and diplomatic objectives. The human cost of the delay was enormous. Thousands of soldiers and civilians continued to suffer, caught between hope and despair. The prolonged uncertainty tested the resilience of all those touched by the war. Ultimately, after 2 grueling years, an armistice agreement was signed on July 27, 1953. But even then, it was not a peace treaty, merely a ceasefire, a fragile pause in hostilities that would leave Korea divided and tense for decades to come. The peace that wouldn't come during those long negotiations was a testament to the profound challenges of ending war, especially one rooted in ideological conflict and global power struggles. It was a reminder that peace is not merely the absence of fighting, but a complex, fragile achievement demanding compromise, trust, and often painful patience. In the shadow of the Korean War, the lessons of Panmunjom endure about the cost of conflict, the difficulty of diplomacy, and the enduring human yearning for peace in a fractured world. Chapter 19: Napalm and Destruction. From the skies above Korea, fire rained down with an unrelenting fury, transforming towns and cities into smoldering ruins and leaving scars that would linger for generations. The Korean War, already brutal in its ground fighting, was marked by the devastating power of aerial bombardment, and nowhere was this more tragically evident than in the controversial and widespread use of napalm. This incendiary weapon, combined with relentless bombing campaigns, wrought destruction on a scale that reshaped the landscape and etched deep wounds in the hearts of millions. Napalm, an incendiary gel that clings to surfaces and burns at temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius, became a weapon synonymous with terror and devastation in Korea. First developed during World War II, napalm found its lethal debut over the Korean Peninsula, deployed extensively by U.S. forces seeking to break enemy fortifications, destroy supply routes, and terrorize opposing troops. Yet its effects extended far beyond military targets. In countless villages and urban centers, napalm bombs engulfed buildings, homes, and forests, turning once vibrant communities into infernos. The distinctive, terrible roar of burning napalm filled the air, accompanied by thick, choking clouds of smoke and the cries of those caught beneath its flames. Survivors spoke of the weapon's horrific impact: flesh seared, limbs burned, entire neighborhoods razed to cinders in moments. The psychological effect was devastating as well. For soldiers and civilians alike, the threat of napalm was omnipresent, an instrument of fear designed not only to destroy but to break the human spirit. In many ways, it symbolized the brutal calculus of total war, where the distinction between combatant and non-combatant blurred amid the flames. Beyond napalm, the broader bombing campaign intensified the devastation. U.S. strategic bombers, including the massive B-29 superfortresses, launched waves of attacks on North Korean infrastructure, transportation networks, and military installations. Entire cities were leveled, railways torn apart, and factories reduced to rubble. The relentless air assaults aimed to cripple the enemy's ability to wage war, but at a tragic cost. The North Korean capital of Pyongyang, along with other major cities like Hamhung and Wonsan, bore the brunt of these bombings. Historic landmarks, cultural treasures, and civilian homes were destroyed. Millions were displaced, their lives uprooted by the thunderous explosions and roaring fires. This widespread destruction sparked intense debate and controversy, both during the war and in its aftermath. Critics condemned the use of napalm and extensive bombing as indiscriminate and inhumane, arguing that they caused unnecessary suffering and violated the principles of proportionality and distinction in warfare. The images of burned civilians and ruined cities fueled global outrage and became powerful symbols in anti-war movements. Military strategists and policymakers, however, defended the tactics as necessary to break the stalemate on the ground and force enemy capitulation. They pointed to the difficulty of fighting a war where front lines shifted rapidly and enemy forces blended with civilian populations. Air power, they argued, was a vital tool to disrupt supply lines and reduce enemy fighting capability. Yet, regardless of justification, the human toll was staggering. Civilian casualties numbered in the hundreds of thousands, with countless more injured, displaced, or psychologically scarred. Entire generations bore the trauma of war's fiery wrath, survivors haunted by memories of burning homes, lost loved ones, and endless nights of terror. The environmental impact was also profound. Forests and farmland were destroyed, rivers polluted, and the landscape forever altered. Recovery would take decades, and the scars of napalm and bombing would remain etched into Korea's collective memory. Artists, writers, and historians have since grappled with the legacy of this destruction, capturing the anguish, resilience, and complexity of a war fought not only with guns and tanks, but with fire and flame. Their works remind us that behind every strategic calculation lie human lives forever changed. In reflecting on napalm and destruction during the Korean War, we confront difficult truths about the nature of modern warfare, its capacity for immense devastation, the moral dilemmas it poses, and the enduring consequences for those caught in its path. The Korean War's fiery reign was a brutal testament to the costs of conflict. It reshaped cities, altered landscapes, and left a legacy of pain that calls us to remember, to understand, and to strive for a world where such destruction might never again be unleashed. Chapter 20. The Forgotten Soldiers. War often shines its brightest light on the grand battles, the famous generals, and the sweeping movements of armies. Yet, beneath the thunderous roar of artillery and the clamorous charge of infantry, lie countless stories of individuals whose sacrifices remain largely unrecognized. In the Korean War, amid the clashing forces and geopolitical drama, there emerged a legion of forgotten soldiers, those whose courage and endurance shaped the conflict, but whose names are rarely spoken. Among them were African American troops, Korean porters, nurses, and many others. Unsung heroes whose stories deserve to be told with reverence, clarity, and compassion. African American soldiers played a vital role in the Korean War, even as they fought not only an external enemy, but also the internal battle against racial segregation and discrimination. Though President Truman had officially ordered the desegregation of the U.S. Armed Forces in 1948, integration was uneven and often resisted. Many African American troops found themselves assigned to support roles or segregated units, yet their contributions were essential. These soldiers served as infantrymen, tank crews, engineers, and medics, displaying remarkable bravery in some of the war's fiercest battles. The 24th Infantry Regiment, one of the last segregated units, fought valiantly despite facing systemic prejudice and often inadequate resources. Stories of valor emerged, soldiers charging enemy positions under intense fire, holding defensive lines against overwhelming odds, and risking their lives to save comrades. Beyond the battlefield, African American soldiers confronted the harsh reality of discrimination both within the military and in the society they protected. Their fight for equality was a battle within a battle, a struggle for dignity amid the chaos of war. Yet, despite the obstacles, they forged bonds of brotherhood and left a legacy of courage that paved the way for future generations. Meanwhile, the Korean War's vast logistical demands brought forth another group of indispensable yet overlooked figures, Korean porters. Known as the White Horse Division by some, these men carried supplies, ammunition, and equipment across treacherous mountain trails and rugged terrain, often under enemy fire and in brutal weather. Their loads could weigh over 100 pounds, yet they traversed icy slopes and narrow passes, enabling frontline troops to continue fighting. The porters' role was grueling and dangerous, but their dedication was unwavering. They were the lifeline for many units, moving through a landscape that challenged even the strongest soldiers. Their contributions, often unrecognized in official histories, were vital to sustaining the war effort in the midst of the war's destruction and suffering. Nurses emerged as pillars of strength and compassion. Women, both Korean and from UN countries, including the United States, staffed field hospitals and evacuation centers. They faced the horrors of war daily, treating grievous wounds, managing infections, and comforting the dying. These nurses worked in harsh conditions, with limited supplies, long hours, and the constant threat of enemy attack. Yet their resolve never wavered. They were often the first to arrive and the last to leave, embodying resilience and humanity amid devastation. Their stories speak of courage not measured in gunfire, but in healing hands, soothing words, and unwavering care. In addition to African American soldiers, Korean porters, and nurses, countless others contributed to the war effort in ways that seldom capture the spotlight. Clerks, translators, chaplains, drivers, and medical technicians each played a role in the complex machinery of war. Civilians who endured bombings and displacement supported troops and maintained the spirit of their communities. Together, they formed a mosaic of sacrifice and service. The stories of these forgotten soldiers remind us that war is not only fought by generals and infantry, but by a vast, interconnected network of people, each facing unique challenges, fears, and hopes. Their experiences reveal the full humanity of conflict, with all its contradictions, bravery and fear, sacrifice and survival, despair and hope. By remembering the forgotten soldiers of the Korean War, we honor their contributions and enrich our understanding of history. Their voices, once muted by time and circumstance, deserve to be heard as testimonies to courage, endurance, and the enduring human spirit amid the darkness of war. In honoring their memory, we acknowledge that the true cost of war lies not only in territory gained or lost, but in the countless lives touched, transformed, and forever marked by the struggle for peace and justice. Chapter 21. Silent Battlefields. War is not always waged in the open, where armies clash amid smoke and steel. Often, the fiercest battles unfold in shadows, where silence, secrecy, and subtlety become weapons as deadly as guns and bombs. The Korean War, known for its brutal frontline combat and sweeping offensives, also hosted an intense, hidden conflict, a silent battlefield of espionage, intelligence operations, and secret missions that shaped the course of the war in ways the public rarely saw or understood. From the earliest days of the war, intelligence was paramount. Commanders on all sides recognized that knowledge of enemy positions, plans, morale, and movements could mean the difference between victory and defeat. But gaining that knowledge required more than just reconnaissance planes or intercepted radio signals. It demanded spies, informants, covert operatives, and clandestine networks operating behind enemy lines, and in the murky realm of deception, the United States, South Korea, North Korea, China, and the Soviet Union each deployed intelligence agencies and special units tasked with gathering information, sabotaging enemy operations, and influencing events from the shadows. The Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, and other allied intelligence groups orchestrated secret missions deep into North Korean and Chinese territory, often with great risk and uncertain outcomes. These missions included inserting agents to gather vital military intelligence, establishing clandestine communication lines, and conducting sabotage operations targeting transportation routes, supply depots, and communications infrastructure. The agents, many trained in guerrilla tactics and espionage tradecraft, faced enormous dangers. Capture often meant torture, imprisonment, or execution. One of the most perilous aspects of intelligence work was recruiting and handling local informants and resistance fighters. These collaborators provided essential information about enemy troop movements, fortifications, and supply chains. Yet their lives were precarious. Betrayal or discovery by opposing forces could mean swift death for them and their families. The silent battlefields were also arenas of psychological warfare and misinformation. Propaganda campaigns sought to confuse enemy intelligence, spread false information, and disrupt decision-making processes. Radio broadcasts, forged documents, and deceptive maneuvers created a fog of uncertainty designed to keep commanders guessing and destabilize enemy morale. Signals. Intelligence, intercepting and decoding enemy communications, played a crucial role. Allied cryptologists worked tirelessly to break codes and decode messages, providing frontline commanders with timely insights. These efforts required extraordinary skill and persistence, often carried out in darkened rooms far from the battlefield. Yet their impact was profound. North Korean and Chinese intelligence agencies, supported by Soviet advisors, ran their own espionage networks. They sought to infiltrate South Korean government institutions, UN forces, and diplomatic circles. Double agents, covert operatives, and sabotage teams operated with equal ruthlessness and cunning, aiming to undermine enemy efforts and gather strategic intelligence. The personal stories of spies and secret operatives reveal a world of tension, moral ambiguity, and extraordinary courage. Some were motivated by ideology, others by patriotism or survival. They lived double lives, balancing fear and resolve as they navigated hostile terrain and constant danger. Their successes often went unrecognized publicly, and many paid the ultimate price in silence. Secret prisoner exchanges, covert negotiations, and back-channel communications also characterized this unseen war. Behind the formal talks and open hostilities, intelligence operatives facilitated contact, gathered crucial information, and sometimes helped pave the way for ceasefires and peace agreements. The silent battlefields were a testament to the complexity of the Korean War, a conflict not merely fought with tanks and rifles, but with minds, shadows, and secrets. These operations shaped key moments of the war, saving lives, guiding strategies, and exposing vulnerabilities. Yet, they're clandestine. Nature means many stories remain hidden, locked away in classified archives, or lost to time. What is known comes from declassified documents, memoirs of former agents, and painstaking historical research. These sources paint a picture of a war fought in silence, but no less fiercely than on the front lines. As we reflect on the silent battlefields of the Korean War, we honor those who worked in the shadows, whose courage, sacrifice, and skill helped shape the course of history, often without recognition or glory. Their invisible battles remind us that in war, the unseen can be as decisive as the seen, and that the struggle for truth and survival is waged not only with force, but with intelligence, subtlety, and unyielding resolve. Chapter 22. Endless Negotiations. The bitter guns of the Korean War had blazed across mountains and rivers, shattered cities, and scarred thousands of lives. Yet, despite the devastation, the conflict did not end with a decisive victory or surrender. Instead, it bled into a protracted and exhausting struggle of words, and willpower, the endless negotiations at Panmunjom. Here, in a modest village split by a fence and guarded by vigilant soldiers, peace was pursued through painstaking diplomacy, where every word, every pause, every comma was fiercely debated. When the armistice talks began in July 1951, hopes soared. That the killing would cease, that families torn apart could be reunited, and that the Korean Peninsula might at last find rest. But the negotiations quickly revealed themselves to be far more complex and fraught than anyone had anticipated. The delegations came from starkly different worlds, North Korea and China on one side, the United Nations command, dominated by the United States, on the other. The representatives spoke different languages, harbored deep distrust, and were bound by conflicting political imperatives. The Korean War had become a proxy for the global Cold War, a theater where ideological battles played out with deadly seriousness. As such, the talks became a grueling battle of diplomacy as intense as the combat on the front lines. The central issue, the terms of a ceasefire, was riddled with complications. The fate of prisoners of war consumed much of the discourse, stalling progress for months on end. The communist side demanded the immediate, unconditional return of all prisoners. The United Nations, however, insisted that prisoners should be repatriated voluntarily, allowing individuals to decide their own futures. This seemingly narrow disagreement represented deeper questions about sovereignty, justice, and the very nature of the war itself. The talks moved painstakingly forward, then stalled, over issues both large and minuscule. Delegates debated the precise wording of the armistice. The placement of a single comma could imply concessions or bind obligations that each side sought to avoid. Protocols for inspections, mechanisms to enforce ceasefire terms, and arrangements for demilitarized zones were endlessly scrutinized. Each concession was measured against political risk, public opinion, and strategic necessity. For the soldiers and civilians caught in the conflict's grip, the drawn-out negotiations were a cruel limbo. Battles raged on nearby even as diplomats spoke of peace. Frontline troops endured hardship, loss, and uncertainty, unsure if the next day would bring more fighting or a fragile truce. Families lived in anxious suspense, torn between hope and despair. The psychological toll on the negotiators themselves was immense. Days blurred into weeks, and weeks into months. The intense pressure to represent national interests while seeking a workable compromise weighed heavily. Behind closed doors, tempers flared, frustrations simmered, and moments of tentative understanding emerged only to be shattered by renewed deadlock. Outside Panmunjom, the world watched closely. News of the talks influenced politics in Washington, Beijing, and Moscow. It shaped public opinion in Seoul, Pyongyang, and far beyond. Every statement, gesture, or leaked document was scrutinized, sometimes inflaming tensions further, other times paving cautious pathways to progress. Despite the stalemates, moments of humanity punctuated the tense atmosphere. Delegates shared brief exchanges, an unguarded smile, a rare acknowledgement of shared suffering, a fleeting gesture of goodwill. These glimpses underscored the paradox of diplomacy in war, the necessity of dialogue amid profound enmity, the endless negotiations. At Panmunjom extended over nearly 2 years. It was only in July 1953, after over 700 days of talks, that the armistice was finally signed. Not a peace treaty, but a ceasefire agreement. The fighting ceased, but the war's political and emotional wounds remained raw. The Korean Peninsula was divided by a demilitarized zone, a narrow strip of land that became one of the most heavily fortified borders in the world. The hopes for reconciliation remained unfulfilled, but the armistice prevented further bloodshed. It was a fragile peace born of exhaustion, compromise, and the recognition of an impasse. Reflecting on the endless negotiations, we see the profound challenges of forging peace in a world marked by distrust and conflict. The talks at Panmunjom reveal the painstaking work behind ceasefires, where every word carries weight, every delay breeds hardship, and every breakthrough demands courage. The legacy of these negotiations endures. They remind us that peace is rarely swift or simple. It is a process of dialogue, patience, and persistent effort, a battle waged not with guns, but with words. In the silence that followed the signing, the quiet after the storm, the Korean War left a stark lesson. The path to peace is often as arduous as the path to war. Chapter 23. The Final Offensives. As the brutal conflict neared its third year, the war-weary soldiers of both sides found themselves embroiled in relentless, desperate campaigns. The final offensives that would test endurance, courage, and resolve to their absolute limits. Though peace talks had dragged on for months, the fighting continued unabated, driven by strategic imperatives and the grim calculus of war. These last-ditch attempts to seize ground before a ceasefire would leave thousands dead, countless wounded. An entire landscape scarred in a tragic coda to the Korean War. By mid-1953, the front lines had settled into a precarious stalemate near the 38th parallel, the line that had, for years, divided the peninsula and its people. Both sides recognized the inevitability of an armistice, but no commander wished to concede any advantage. In the final months, every inch of territory was fiercely contested, as military leaders sought to improve their positions before the guns fell silent. The United Nations Command, led by General Mark Clark, launched a series of offensives to seize key high ground and disrupt enemy supply lines. Rugged hills, strategic outposts, and vital roadways became battlefields of extraordinary violence, with troops enduring relentless artillery barrages, hand-to-hand combat, and bitter weather conditions. These offensives aimed to strengthen the UN's negotiating stance, securing advantageous terrain to influence the coming ceasefire line. Opposing them, the Chinese People's Volunteer Army and North Korean forces responded with equally determined counterattacks. These troops, battle-hardened and fiercely motivated, fought with a tenacity born of defending their homeland and ideology. Their assaults were often launched under the cover of darkness or fierce storms, designed to reclaim lost ground and break enemy lines. The fighting in these final months was marked by extraordinary intensity and tragic human cost. Battles like those for Old Baldy, Triangle Hill, and Pork Chop Hill became symbols of the savage struggle. Hills and ridges that changed hands repeatedly, sometimes within hours, soaked in blood and soaked into memory. Commanders committed thousands of troops to assaults and counter-assaults, with gains measured in yards rather than miles, and at terrible cost. For the soldiers, the end of the war remained elusive. Exhausted by years of combat, many questioned the purpose of such fierce fighting when peace was so close. Yet, amidst fear and fatigue, acts of heroism and brotherhood shone through. Medics tended to the wounded under fire. Small units held positions against overwhelming odds. Letters home spoke of longing and hope. Civilian populations, caught in the crossfire, or fresh suffering. Villages near the front lines were bombarded, homes destroyed, and families uprooted once more. The war's devastation was compounded, deepening the tragedy that had engulfed Korea since 1950. Behind the scenes, political leaders and diplomats intensified efforts to finalize an armistice. But on the ground, the tempo of violence surged. Each side aimed to improve its bargaining power, believing that the territory held at the time of the ceasefire would shape the peninsula's future. Artillery thundered day and night, and airstrikes rained destruction on enemy positions. Soldiers dug new trenches, reinforced bunkers, and braced for the next assault. Casualty figures mounted, thousands killed or wounded in battles whose strategic value often seemed overshadowed by the immense human cost. Despite the ferocity of these final offensives, the war's outcome was no longer decided by battlefield victories alone. The grueling negotiations at Panmunjom continued, shaping hopes for an end to hostilities. Military commanders were caught between their duty to press the fight and the anticipation of peace. On July 27, 1953, after months of bloodshed, an armistice agreement was finally signed. The fighting ceased, but the scars of those final battles lingered, etched in the landscapes, in the memories of survivors, and in the history of a war that had devastated a nation and tested the endurance of the world. The final offensives of The Korean War stands as a solemn reminder of war's cruel relentlessness. In its closing moments, the conflict demanded the highest price, underscoring the tragedy of a war fought with ferocity even as peace beckoned. It is a chapter marked by sacrifice, sorrow, and the unyielding human spirit confronting the cruel tides of history. Chapter 24. Armistice at Last. On a summer day, July 27, 1953, the long, brutal conflict that had consumed the Korean Peninsula for over 3 years reached a solemn, if uneasy, pause. After months of painstaking, tension-filled negotiations, an armistice agreement was finally signed at Panmunjom. The guns fell silent, the battle lines held, and a ceasefire took effect. Yet, amid the relief, the promise of lasting peace remained elusive. The Korean War had ended, but peace, true, enduring peace, would never fully arrive. The peninsula remained divided, its people separated by a heavily fortified border and a shadow of conflict that lingers to this day. The journey to the armistice was fraught with complexity. Negotiations had stretched over 2 grueling years, filled with bitter disputes, delays, and moments of despair. Every clause was fiercely debated, every word a battleground in itself. The core issues, prisoner repatriation, the exact demarcation of borders, and mechanisms for maintaining the ceasefire, tested the patience and resolve of diplomats and military leaders alike. As the armistice was signed, the formalities concealed the deep scars left by the war. Over 1 million soldiers and civilians had perished. Countless more were wounded, displaced, or broken by the trauma of conflict. Cities lay in ruins. Families were torn apart. A nation was scarred by division. The armistice did not erase these wounds. It merely drew a line, both physical and symbolic, between a devastating past and an uncertain future. The demilitarized zone, or DMZ, established by the agreement became a stark embodiment of this division. Stretching roughly 250 kilometers across the peninsula, it became one of the most heavily fortified borders in the world, a buffer zone where soldiers from opposing sides faced one another in silent tension, an uneasy coexistence born of hostility and unresolved enmity. For millions of Koreans, the armistice was both a relief and a heartbreak. Families remained separated, unable to cross borders to see loved ones. The dream of reunification, a nation whole once more, was deferred indefinitely. The peninsula's split became a defining feature of the Cold War era, a flashpoint in the global struggle between communism and democracy. The political landscape shifted dramatically in the aftermath. South Korea, with the support of the United States and United Nations, began the arduous task of reconstruction and democratization, eventually emerging as a vibrant economy and a key ally in the region. Meanwhile, the North, under a rigid communist regime, focused on consolidation of power, military buildup, and ideological control, leading to stark contrasts in governance, economic development, and society. Despite the armistice, the Korean Peninsula remained a tinderbox. Skirmishes, espionage, and occasional outbreaks of violence punctuated the decades that followed. The peace was cold, uneasy, a truce rather than a resolution. It was a constant reminder that the underlying conflicts, political, ideological, and territorial, remained unsettled. The legacy of the Korean War's armistice echoes in the lives of Koreans and the geopolitics of East Asia. It shapes relations between the North and South, influences global security concerns, and informs diplomatic efforts aimed at reconciliation. The Divided Peninsula stands as a powerful symbol of the enduring consequences of war and the challenges of peace. As we reflect on the armistice of July 27, 1953, we confront a paradox. The war ended, yet its wounds remain fresh. The ceasefire brought respite, but the quest for genuine peace, reconciliation, and reunification continues. The Korean War's armistice is a chapter not just in military history, but in the ongoing story of human resilience, hope, and the complex pursuit of harmony amid division. In the silence that followed the guns, the Korean Peninsula found itself suspended between past and future, between the memories of war and the longing for peace. The armistice was a moment of ending and beginning, a fragile foundation on which the hopes and struggles of millions would rest for generations to come. Chapter 25. A country in ruins. The guns had fallen silent, the ceasefire signed, and yet the Korean Peninsula lay in devastation, a land scarred by 3 years of relentless war, a nation shattered and frozen in time. Over 3 million souls, soldiers, and civilians alike, had been claimed by the conflict. Countless families were torn apart, displaced, or lost forever. Cities lay in rubble, villages were razed. The social fabric of a proud people was stretched to its breaking point. The aftermath of the Korean War was not just a tally of destruction, but a deep, haunting trauma that would shape the lives and futures of millions, from the icy mountains of the north to the battered cities of the south. Korea bore the marks of war's fury. Pyongyang, once a vibrant capital, was reduced to ruins. Seoul, having changed hands 4 times during the conflict, was scarred by shell craters, demolished buildings, and shattered infrastructure. Roads and railways, lifelines for commerce and connection, lay severed or unusable. The fields, once fertile, were pocked with bomb craters, the land polluted with remnants of explosives and fire. Amid this physical devastation, the human cost was staggering. More than 1 million civilians perished, caught in bombings, caught in crossfire, or victims of starvation and disease as war disrupted the fragile systems of life. Millions more were wounded, maimed, or psychologically scarred, carrying invisible burdens that would last lifetimes. Families faced agonizing separations. The division of the peninsula, solidified by the armistice line and the demilitarized zone, severed not only land but the ties of kinship. Brothers, sisters, parents, and children found themselves stranded on opposite sides of an invisible but insurmountable border. Efforts to reconnect were thwarted by political hostility and military tension. For many, the hope of reunion remained a distant dream. Refugees poured into safer areas, swelling the populations of southern cities already struggling with scarcity and ruin. Makeshift camps emerged, where displaced persons lived in dire conditions, facing hunger, illness, and uncertainty. The war had uprooted millions, creating a humanitarian crisis that demanded urgent response amid a fragile post-war landscape. The social and economic structures of Korea were shattered. Industries lay dormant. Farms were abandoned or destroyed. Educational institutions struggled to resume amid chaos. The young generation, in particular, faced lost years of schooling and opportunity. The war's trauma would echo in the psyche of the nation, shaping cultural memory, art, literature, and political discourse for decades. International aid began to flow, but reconstruction was slow and fraught with challenges. South Korea, with support from the United States and other allies, embarked on the arduous path of rebuilding. The nation's resilience, determination, and emerging leadership would eventually transform it into a modern economic powerhouse. Yet, the scars of war, both physical and emotional, remained deeply embedded. In the north, the regime under Kim Il-sung focused on military consolidation and ideological control. The landscape, similarly devastated, was rebuilt along a different path, one marked by isolation, militarization, and stark economic hardship. The division of Korea crystallized a broader Cold War conflict, dividing not only land but destinies. The shattered country was frozen, caught in the standoff between global powers, divided by ideologies, and marked by the memory of loss. The Korean War's aftermath was not simply about buildings or borders, but about people, their pain, their endurance, and their unyielding hope for a future beyond ruin. As we look upon this country in ruins, we confront the profound cost of war, not only in lives lost, but in the tearing apart of communities, cultures, and futures. The devastation of Korea is a somber reminder of the price paid when conflict erupts, and a call to honor the resilience of those who endured. The Korean Peninsula, scarred and divided, stands as a testament to the fragility of peace and the enduring strength of humanity. In the ruins, there is a story of survival, of rebuilding, and of a nation's relentless quest to heal from the wounds of war. Chapter 26. The War That Never Ended. The Korean War, fought from 1950 to 1953, was often called the Forgotten War, overshadowed in the public memory by the greater dramas of World War II and Vietnam. Yet, despite the armistice that silenced the guns, this conflict never truly ended. It lingered like a ghost, haunting the Divided Peninsula, shaping global politics, and casting a long, ominous shadow over the Cold War and beyond. To this day, the war's legacy pulses through the heartbeat of international relations, a constant reminder that peace, in Korea and the world, remains fragile and elusive. As the ceasefire took effect in July 1953, the world breathed a cautious sigh of relief. Yet, beneath that fragile calm, tensions simmered. The division of Korea into two starkly different states, the Communist North and the Democratic South, was more than a political boundary. It was a front line in a global ideological struggle. The Korean Peninsula became the flashpoint where the Cold War's most dangerous confrontations played out. The armistice was not a peace treaty. It was a ceasefire, a pause in a conflict that was never fully resolved. Both North and South Korea remained technically at war, a state of suspended hostility marked by military posturing, border skirmishes, and an ever-present threat of renewed violence. Soldiers stood guard along the demilitarized zone, a narrow strip of land lined with minefields, watchtowers, and barbed wire, a symbol of division and tension. The Cold War deepened the Korean conflict's global significance. Korea was no longer just a regional issue. It became a battleground for superpower rivalry. The United States, committed to containing communism, maintained a significant military presence in South Korea, pledging to defend it from northern aggression. The Soviet Union, and later China, backed the North, fueling an arms race and deepening the divide. In this tense geopolitical landscape, the threat of nuclear weapons emerged as a terrifying reality. The Korean War was the first significant armed conflict after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and it revealed the catastrophic potential of modern warfare. The United States' strategic use of overwhelming firepower, including heavy bombing campaigns and the controversial use of napalm, underscored the destructive power at play. As the decades unfolded, both Koreas pursued nuclear capabilities, though only North Korea successfully developed nuclear weapons. The North's nuclear program became a central concern of international diplomacy and security, sparking crises that reverberate today. Nuclear threats, missile tests, and aggressive rhetoric from Pyongyang have kept the peninsula and the world on edge, underscoring the enduring volatility of the Korean conflict. Beyond military tensions, the war's legacy shaped political, economic, and social realities on the peninsula. South Korea's transformation from a war-torn nation to an economic powerhouse is a story of resilience and determination. The country's rapid industrialization, democratization, and global integration stand in stark contrast to the isolated, authoritarian regime of the North. Yet, the division persists, a barrier to reunification and a source of human tragedy. With millions separated from families across the border, the Korean War also had profound impacts on U.S. foreign policy and military strategy. It cemented the United States' commitment to collective security through alliances such as NATO and the Defense Pact with South Korea. It spurred the militarization of the Cold War, influencing conflicts in Vietnam, the Middle East, and beyond. The experience shaped military doctrine, emphasizing rapid deployment, technological superiority, and nuclear deterrence. Internationally, the Korean War highlighted the complexities of multilateral intervention under the banner of the United Nations. It was the first significant conflict where the UN authorized collective military action, setting precedents for future peacekeeping and coalition operations. Yet, it also exposed limitations, political divisions among member states, the influence of superpowers, and the challenges of enforcing peace amid global rivalry. The war's cultural and psychological legacies are profound. For Koreans on both sides, the conflict is a defining chapter, etched into national identity, literature, film, and collective memory. The trauma of war, The pain of separation and the hope for reconciliation persist across generations. Memorials, museums, and commemorations keep the memory alive, reminding the world of the cost of division and the yearning for peace. Efforts at reconciliation and dialogue have been sporadic and often fraught. Periods of thaw and rapprochement, such as family reunions, diplomatic talks, and agreements on reducing tensions, have alternated with setbacks and provocations. The road to peace remains uncertain, shaped by domestic politics, regional dynamics, and the interests of global powers. As we stand decades after the war's guns fell silent, the Korean conflict remains one of the most enduring and dangerous legacies of the 20th century. It is a war without a formal end, a frozen conflict, with the potential to ignite anew. Its echoes reverberate in diplomatic corridors, military strategies, and the lives of millions living in the shadow of division. The Korean War's legacy challenges us to understand the complexities of peace and conflict in a world where history's wounds are never fully healed. It reminds us that the cost of unresolved wars is not only measured in battlefield losses, but in generations marked by fear, separation, and uncertainty. In reflecting on the war that never ended, we confront a truth both sobering and urgent. Peace is fragile, security is complex, and the pursuit of reconciliation requires courage, patience, and a steadfast commitment to dialogue. The Korean Peninsula remains a testament to these challenges, its divided landscapes and peoples a living history of conflict and hope. The war's legacy shapes global politics today, reminding us that the struggle for peace is ongoing, and that the lessons of Korea must not be forgotten as history unfolds. The shadow of the Korean War lingers, a powerful, poignant reminder that some wars never truly end, but their legacies continue to shape the destinies of nations and the course of the world.